Today, I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Swan Private. Now, you know from listening to this show that our money is broken. Fortunately, we have Bitcoin, a better money that will help us build a brighter future. But if you don't have a Bitcoin strategy and a trusted partner to help you execute that strategy, then you're probably going to fall behind. Now, I've known the Swan Bitcoin team for years. The Bitcoiners at Swan are mission-driven and have deep expertise and respect in the Bitcoin space. In my opinion, this is the team you want on your side. Today, I'd like to highlight Swan's Private Client Services division, which guides high net worth individuals and businesses around the world toward building and preserving wealth with Bitcoin. So visit swanprivate.com and learn how this concierge service gives you direct access to your dedicated Bitcoin advisor by phone, messaging, and email. Swan will guide you on complex areas such as self-custody, or you can choose to hold your Bitcoin through Swan with one of the largest US-regulated custodians. So, make your first purchase with Swan Private and get $100 of Bitcoin. Just tell them that I sent you. You know, an opportunity like this to build and preserve legacy-impacting wealth for your family and company will not likely be seen again in our lifetimes. Sign up at swanprivate.com today, mention Breed Love to your advisor, and get $100 in free Bitcoin when you make your first buy. Mr. John Vervaeke, welcome back to the What is Money show.
It's great to be here again, Robert. I've really enjoyed this, and rereading Plato's Critique of Impure Reason with you and dialoguing with you about it has been really wonderful. So thank you for that.
I completely echo what you have to say about that. I've set aside 3 hours each day to prepare for these conversations.
Yeah.
And yeah, they're both really enjoyable. Just rereading the work and then actually having the dialogue with you and seeing it, through your eyes to some extent. It's really just a rewarding, fulfilling experience. So I hope the audience finds a lot of value in this as well.
Yes.
So today we're going to go through chapter 5 and the last chapter, which is called the Coda, C-O-D-A.
Yeah.
And chapter 5 is titled "The Truth is Defenseless," and has a subtitle, "Or How the Truth Viewed as Indemonstrably and Thus Indefensibly Good Provides a Response to the Sophistic Logic of Violence."
Yes.
I thought that was just an excellent subtitle. So as is usual here, I'll just start rolling with an excerpt. And I'm on page 229 for this one.
Okay, let me just get there. Great.
And Schindler writes, "For every real being, there are 3 things that are necessary if knowledge of it is to be acquired. First, the name. Second, the definition. Third, the image. Knowledge comes fourth. And in the 5th place, we must put the object itself, the knowable and truly real being."
Yes.
Now, these 5 levels, I think he revisits throughout the rest of this chapter.
Yes, he does.
And at the bottom of this paragraph, he also writes, "From this perspective, a definition, like a name or an image, will provide not an endpoint, but a stepping stone toward the final goal, namely knowledge itself."
Yes.
So maybe if you just speak to those 5 levels of knowing, because maybe this maps on to your 4 Ps to some extent. I'm not exactly sure, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on this opening.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Although I do think the question of the images comes up more in the coda of the restoring the appearances. So maybe we can put off the discussion of the images and the imaginal until we do the coda. Yeah, so the name and the definition would fall under, for me, like the concept and the proposition, 2 parts of the propositional. And then it's interesting that, right, you move through the image, which, like I say, we'll talk about later, but I think that has to do with the imaginal and perspectival knowing. And then knowledge comes forth. And that's really interesting when you think about it, because first of all, as Schindler rightly points out, Plato doesn't see knowledge arising in the conclusion of a definition, which is how we sort of tend to think of it today, the sort of definitive grasp on the thing. There's something that comes beyond that. Now, I think what could be helpful here is a really important book by Moline, who argues that very often what we translate as knowledge in Plato, episteme, where we get epistemology from, is better translated as understanding. In fact, his book is called Plato's Theory of Understanding. And I take it that that is what Schindler is going to do. And what I mean by that is Schindler starts to get this discussion about, all of the implications that follow from something, all the consequences, and that's very important. But then there has to be that which, well, as we've been talking about, the through line, the integration, that's the absolute for all those relatives, that is how it is in itself and all of that. So if that's right, and it seems to comport well with how Schindler proceeds in the chapter, I would say that what comes forth is knowledge in the sense of understanding. And what's interesting about that for me, and this goes back to Moline and also Gonzalo's work and others, is the most important, and I have to use this word and undermine it, the most important implication of what one knows is not itself, a logical implication of another proposition. It's something that's been coming out in current philosophy of science and psychology. And I'll sort of put it in a bit of a slogan to try it. Knowledge is about evidence, but understanding is about relevance. So notice when we ask if somebody understands something, this was a point made by Smedlin. We ask them first, make sure they can do synonyms. That's like the name of the thing. So I say some term, do you understand? And then first I'll ask you for a synonym. That's like, give me another name for it. And then I'll ask you, what contradicts it or what's implied by it. And those are all the things we've been discussing. And then Smedlin says, but then there's what's relevant to it, or how is it relevant to other things? And that's when, right, you're starting to grasp the significance of something above and beyond, right, the relations of logical implication to it. So you can see the name and the proposition coming out there. And then we move into understanding. Now, here's the thing I've argued repeatedly elsewhere, extensively in publication in the series, so I'm not going to remake the argument here, but it's a crucial argument. Relevance is not a propositional property. It's not part of the logical syntactic structure. It's all right of a proposition. Relevance is presupposed by representation. It's presupposed by inference, etc., etc. So when you move into understanding, you're now moving into the non-propositional significance of something. Now, as soon as you move into the non-propositional significance, you are then trying to, right, hopefully, if you want intelligibility, find the melody through all of those. You're trying to find the through line. And then that's the ecstatic element. That through line is the call to you to conform yourself to that which is not any aspect or property of a thing or perspective on it, but the through line from all of them, and always calls you into that inexhaustible nature of the reality of the thing and how it transcends you. And that, for me, is when you are in the act of conforming to the reality of the thing in itself. So what I've said sort of builds on everything we've talked about before. I brought in a bit of supplementation that I think is appropriate to Schindler to answer your question. And what's really interesting about is that we sort of start and stop on the first two levels, and we think that's it. We think we're done. And I first got the hint of this, like about this idea when people would say things like, you know, the point of science is to come to definitions of things. And I sort of get what they're trying to talk about in terms of nomological generalizations, finding laws. But then I thought, no, that's not right, because laws are just about predictions. That's what a law is. It's a universal prediction. And science is also about explanation, which is the generation of understanding. And so you start to move into, okay, what's understanding above and beyond the proposition and the concept, right? Grasping the significance. And then as soon as you're into that process of relevance realization, you try to find, yes, but what is integrating it all together so that it flows intelligibly? And then you're led to everything we've been talking about, to my mind.
Yeah, that's great. Great introduction. What came up for me there while you were speaking, just like in a spelling bee where competitors are asking the I guess presenters of the spelling bee to define the word,
yeah,
and then use it in a sentence, that they're trying to see how the thing is integrated into the whole, right? To help them get a grasp on it. I guess in this case, just the structural grasp of spelling. But it's we're back to that, like, where is the meaning, right? The meaning is not kind of everywhere and nowhere to some extent, or in between, as we might say.
Yes. And it's always that in between isn't a static in between. It's an in between. It's always a calling you to not to finally realize that in your grasping, you also have to be more fundamentally grasped by the reality of a thing. That's sort of a model of truth that Schindler has been arguing for throughout the text.
Yes,
and that's how reason is, again, similar to love, etc. Right.
Which we go straight into next, actually, here. So next excerpt on 230. When Aristotle goes on to say then that the soul becomes identical to its objects when it knows them, the locus of this identity must lie formally within the soul itself. It is perhaps not coincidental that such a view of reason corresponds to Aristotle's view of love. As he explains in the Nicomachean Ethics, self-love is the paradigm of love because it represents an absolute unity that other forms of love can only defectively imitate. The soul's perfect unity with itself is thus, for Aristotle, the beginning and end of both reason and love. And I was reminded here of our earlier discussion on I think it was self-knowledge was the paradigmatic resemblance of the good. Maybe it was self-sufficiency, actually, not self-knowledge.
Well, it's self-knowledge, but right, and an appropriate kind of self-sufficiency. Remember, it's not something you possess; it's something you participate in. And I would add what Schindler goes on to, because he contrasts Plato with Aristotle. In contrast, as we've argued above, Plato espouses an essentially ecstatic notion of love, expressed in the soul's transcendence towards its object, a transcendence that necessarily includes a moment of expropriation. For a soul to join with its object, it does not take the object into itself, as it seems to in Aristotle, but goes out in some sense to enter into the object. So Schindler is presenting Plato as, in this sense, the reverse. And this is the idea of the self not as our fundamental possession, but as our aspiration towards the whole. So this is to replace a romantic notion that, which is in some sense similar in this respect to Aristotle, of the self as self-possession, self-identity, with the Socratic notion of the self as the aspiration to the whole. So the self is that in you, right? The through line in you that wants to through line into reality, if I can appropriate his language. And I think that's a better model. Now, I would then trump both of them with a Neoplatonic account, which says, well, there's actually a continuity here which is what's happening in love is, yes, you are indwelling the other, but you are also internalizing the other. And I've tried to convey that with this notion of reciprocal opening. So it isn't conformity as absorption. It's this ongoing reciprocal reconstruction, indwelling, and internalization. So that is, to my mind, closer to the developmental psychology of Vygotsky towards Aaron, that's a last name, account of the psychology of love. And I think it's actually, to my experience, closer to the phenomenology of love. I do indwell Sarah in that I more and more can see the world from her perspective without ever claiming to totally possess that, because that would be an error. But I also internalize her in that she is now part of the way my perspectival knowing and my sense of myself have been shaped. She's been internalized into the very structural functional organization of how I see and how I be, if I can rhyme there. And so I find that I get the best answer to that question by putting the two together. And that's, so just let's just think, the moment of self-possession is this metacognitive ability to reflect on oneself and to identify with oneself that Aristotle makes primary. But Aristotle forgets or does not know, I only get my ability to take that perspective on myself by first indwelling another's perspective on me and then internalizing it into myself. And so the Platonic notion, I think, is more primary. I think the Aristotelian notion has some value. And I think the Neoplatonic account actually best integrates them together.
Well, that's really interesting, because that maps onto childhood development as well, right? That
Exactly.
They don't understand themselves as a distinct entity until a certain threshold of development, and that's the internalization of their parents. Right. Yeah.
So way before they can introspect and even get the very basics of experiential sort of introspection or metacognition, they are aware of your mind and your perspective on them. And they'll imitate it, they'll indwell it. They indwell it, they will see themselves through your eyes. You can see this beginning in 18-month-old, but you don't get the capacity to metacognitively have an awareness of your own cognition until you're about 4 years of age. Now that's not only a fairly long part of human development, that is like one of the most fundamental stages of human development. I think Plato is deeply right. Aristotle is at times, boy, I'm going to piss off a lot of people, but I find Aristotle incapable of stepping out of an adult male perspective to the degree that Plato can. This is why Plato is so more able to speak about play and childhood and to properly value women. And Aristotle does not talk well of children, and he talks misogynistically about women. And that's not to be an ad hominem argument, but I'm pointing to a sort of epistemic defect in Aristotle that I think is showing up in this instance. I think he is not appropriately aware of what Plato had a better insight into. Now, I'll say one more time, that doesn't mean we should dismiss Aristotle. He is saying something important. And I say, like with Gerson and others, there's actually more continuity between them than difference. And the Neoplatonists put it together, and you get this, right? The reciprocal opening idea, which is what love is.
Yes. Yeah, and okay. Love and reason, we've said, and I think we'll continue to reinforce this point, that it's the reaching beyond themselves that makes it authentic love or reason, right? Reason seeks to undermine itself in a way, as does love to some extent, in that it's reaching beyond itself. Is that seems to be necessary to establish synoptic perception? Like you're describing, you're seeing more of the world through your lover's eyes. Not that you possess her perception, but you're just able to see the world through her eyes the closer you integrate.
And reason seems to be somewhat similar in that we can
Totally.
indwell these ideas that allow us to understand the world. I mean, through many people's eyes, right? All the people's eyes that it took to get to this level of understanding, or this
I think
level of knowledge, maybe.
Well, both. I think that's well said. I think what I like about Schindler's emphasis on the contemplative act, the contemplative sense of rationality, is precisely because this notion of self-transcendence as a transformative self-correction, I think is really important. And so that lines up exactly what you just said. And notice, right? Notice a connection. For you to actually take your lover's view, take how she sees you, right? You have to acknowledge things in you that you have not yet seen in yourself, right? And that's part of the internalization. It's the same thing with the truth, right? Insofar as I've realized how I've not properly grasped the significance, or I have not properly formulated, I have to step outside of my perspective and then acknowledge the limitations within how I'm generating perspectives if I'm actually going to reason as something beyond just manipulating the variables of a formal system.
Yeah, again, becoming more invisible, as we said in the last chapter, right? You
Yes,
find a
yes.
blemish on the mirror, perhaps, and you need to polish it off to better reflect.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
maybe, I don't know if reflections are, to be more, less translucent, more invisible, I guess.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, I'll jump to 232 here. Schindler writes, Plato wants to show that genuine philosophical knowledge cannot be put into words like other things, or perhaps better, that words, as essential as Plato makes them out to be, can never simply substitute for the reality itself. What is it? What is it that can be put into words? He says it is the qualities of an object as distinct from its being. And Schindler goes on to write, if he groups knowledge and right opinion, along with, I think this word is nous, maybe in Greek, together on a single level, it is because there is some feature they share in common, which distinguishes them from everything else. The feature Plato identifies is that they lie in the soul.
Yes.
Notice Plato here is talking specifically about the form of the relationship implied between the soul and reality. He is not, in other words, talking about truth or falsity, stability or instability, which is typically at issue when he distinguishes between knowledge and opinion.
Yes.
Okay, what I'd like to ask you about is in this footnote here. And he says, Schindler writes, or as Gadamir puts it, the distinguishing mark is that these are all things possessed as one's own. And that was the footnote to Plato identifying things as they lie in the soul.
Yes.
So one's own is such key. This is the root of the word, like property, to have one's own, the properties that distinguish something and identify something.
Yes.
I'm just curious about the relationship of the soul's relationship to the real and property more generally. Like this is something I talk about in my work a lot, and I really struggle with it because people typically, when you say the word property in an economic sense, they think, oh, it's the house, it's the car, it's the thing.
Yes.
But what we're actually doing is creating this socially acknowledged exclusive binding between an owner and an asset.
Yes.
And that's what really matters, right? You need to know that you own something. That's what allows you to be intelligent and make good decisions and store the fruits of your labor and become wealthy and all of these things. So it seems like that, again, it's kind of like a through line, right? There's the through line between man's intent and its expression in the world. And, I don't know, I might just be reaching here, but it seems like there's it's kind of meta because there's a relationship between that property relationship and this relationship of the soul to the real.
Yes.
I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that.
So there's a theme that's going to come out, and I'm going to make use, I think it's completely appropriate, of the Freudian distinction here. Plato is going to acknowledge the value of how things are proper to us in the sense you've described here, and that our relationship to them is that binding relationship you talked about. And then he's also going to talk about how we can be proper to the real. And so one way of thinking about this is to see the first as the having mode and the second as being mode. And I remind you once again, it is not that one mode is evil and the other mode is good. Put that aside, that is incorrect, right? It is the confusion that between them that is the error. So what is proper to us is that what we can grasp, what we can appropriate, right? And this is actually appropriate. There are things we need to have control over, to manipulate. Like you said, we need shelter, we need medicine, we need food, we need water, we need oxygen. And so the having mode is appropriate to that. And what do we have of things? Well, we have, to use the language we've been using, we have the aspects of the thing, or we have how they are relative to us, because that is how they are proper to us. But then Plato says that is fine, and right. But in addition to that, there's a reversal where you ask not how are things relevant to me, but how am I relevant to them? And that's expropriation that was mentioned in a previous quote, right? And so this is the reversal of the arrow of relevance that you have in the attitude and act of reverence, where it's not how does this serve me, but how do I bind myself? They're both bindings. You're right about that. But the arrow of the direction of the binding differentiates the modes. And so this binding is our manipulation of the aspects and how we can make things proper to us. But what we can't make proper to us is what we've been talking about a lot, the in-itself-ness of a thing, because that is precisely what we cannot appropriate, right? And then we realize when we move to that, when we want to be in relation to the good of the thing, in that sense that I'm talking about, right? That which is not relative to us, but how the thing has its realness, then we move into the being mode. We want to enter into a appropriate ratio religio to the mystery, because that is how we grow beyond ourselves. The being mode is our developmental mode. It's the ecstatic mode. Now, I'm going to repeat once again, because people will twist this one way or the other. Neither one of these modes is evil or good, because, as we've been talking about before, the relative has to be included within the absolute, or not an opposition, or we don't appropriately understand our relationship to the absolute. So I know that was a more complex answer than you originally proposed, but I think that is what Schindler is trying to reveal in Plato's text. And so one of the things, I mean, this is analogous to, render unto Caesar what is Caesar and render unto God what is God, right? They're not exactly equivalent, but they can talk to each other, I think, in a friendly fashion. And so again, the proper proportioning doesn't just mean a quantitative how much, it means a qualitative which mode are you in, and is it appropriate to what you are doing? Or are you modally confused? Are you trying to grow up by having sex or purchasing a car? But the reverse is also the case. You can be too spiritually minded, and he quotes that in this text. Right? You can be, Schindler does, you can be too spiritually minded to be of any earthly good. You can, right, always be talking about, and this has become a prevailing problem in our society. It's called spiritual bypassing. So Plato is trying, right? Remember, we're always finite. We have real having needs, but we are also bound to transcendence. We have real being needs, and the best life is the one that recognizes them and has the proper proportioning of them.
Yeah, well said. the reversal of that arrow you brought up, that's a reversal of the arrow of relevance realization, I take it.
Well, well, relevance realization is always this. It's sort of the reversal of the intentionality, the directedness of the relevance realization. Is it relevance for me, or is it relevance to? And so when you're a child, you are dominated of how is it relevant to me? Although there is already initially from the very beginning, how am I relevant to mom, right? But when you become, for example, a parent, or even somebody who wants to love another in depth, you move
There's a reversal.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, and the thing we have to understand is both of those, the relative within the having mode and the absolute within the being mode, right, are needed in our relationship to the world and towards being. But if we are confused, modally confused, or we're not properly proportioning them according to what is most rational, then of course we can be messing up in a very deep way. So this is why I keep challenging the simplistic, one is good and the other is evil. It is a much, and as Schindler argues, it's this much more complex interpenetration between the two that we are seeking if we are seeking, right? If we are seeking to be rational in this Platonic sense.
Yeah, great point. I'm just realizing that yesterday we said we were going to finish those last 2 points on chapter 4. And I'm wondering if we should jump backwards and do that now or try to do that towards the end.
I think we should keep rolling with the momentum we've built.
Okay.
And we go back, if we think there's something central to be drawn from those. I reviewed them for today, but I would like to proceed because I think I'm feeling like we're starting to catch the logos, and I don't want to disrupt that. I want to follow it as it will go, as Socrates repeatedly says.
Fair enough. I do the concluding points of the last chapter of minding one's own business and becoming transparent is the only adequate way to speak the truth. I thought those are really important. So maybe we can get back there at some point, but I agree. Let's keep rolling. Okay, I'm going to jump to page 236 here.
Right, I'm jumping with you.
Schindler writes, but when it is the fifth about which we are compelled to answer or make explanations, and again, we're talking about those 4 layers, the fifth being this, I'm sorry, was it just knowledge itself, or was the fifth?
The fifth is the conformity, right? The participation in the reality itself.
The ecstatic moment.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. All right. So that's what this is in regard to. So I'll start over. But when it is the fifth about which we are compelled to answer or make explanations, then anyone who wishes to refute has the advantage and can make the propounder of a doctrine, whether in writing or speaking or in answering questions, seem to most of his listeners completely ignorant of the matter on which he is trying to speak or write.
Right.
Those who are listening sometimes do not realize that it is not the soul of the speaker or writer which is being refuted, but these 4 instruments mentioned, each of which is by nature defective.
Yes. Yes.
So this came again, drawing another connection back to the book Leela by Persic. He makes this point that the perfect metaphysics is as impossible as the perfect chess strategy.
Yes.
That it's not something you can contain or formulate. It's like you've made many examples of this in regard to adaptivity. What is the final form of an organism? Like, it doesn't even make sense, right? It's always
exactly.
Always contextual, I guess, to the environment, fitness to the environment. And so this came up for me. I don't know that it's a correct connection or not, but the truth being defenseless, as he's saying here, is you can't defend this thing because it's not a static thing, right? It's ecstatic, I guess, is the connection.
Yes, exactly. So if somebody is not capable of joining you in a joint journey of self-transformation, self-transcendence, then your ability to argue with them on the basis of something that transcends a framing is going to be seen as ridiculous. This is the Socrates returning back into the cave. And within the rules and parameters of the cave, everything he is saying can just be destroyed by argument, right? By logical argumentation. It's the same thing if I say to you, prove to me that you love your spouse. Prove it to me. Go ahead.
Right.
Prove it to me. Right? Or you know, are you conscious? Yes. Prove it to me. Good luck. Right? So, and by the way, I'm not advocating for any decadent romanticism, which means now we just give into irrational impulse. What I'm trying to indicate is, and what Schindler's trying to indicate is something that I found actually spoken very well of in Spinoza. Whereas, you know, Spinoza says in many places, well, in several places, and in sort of slightly different terms, but he says something like, truth is its own light, truth is its own standard. And that's what I've tried to meant when I said, you have to think of truth adverbially rather than adjectivally. You know, not truth is, you know, whatever predicate, but in truthing, in overcoming how you have misapprehended something, that is the moment of truth, aletheia, as Heidegger would really make central in his work. And that ability to do that and open oneself up to reality transforming you and making a demand on you, that's the moment of truth. Not because the next thing you then land on is the truth, right? And so you think about this again in science. Like many people in science, I'm a fallibilist because the history of science has shown that every theory is ultimately false in some important way. And it is ridiculous to conclude that our theories are in any way other than that. But does that mean, well, science is useless? No, because science has developed this rigorous manner of self-correction. And whenever we move, we can then reflectively realize how we were limited. But that doesn't mean that where we've landed is the truth. And so, yeah, and so I can't conclusively show you what the truth is, even from a scientific perspective, because to do so would be it's a performative contradiction. It would be to deny in one's very actions of speech the very nature of science. Do you see what you see what I'm trying to convey, right? Now, but again, that doesn't give you relativism or your opinion is just as good as mine. No, because the scientists can say, but take this perspective, and from it, you can see the limitations of these other perspectives. Now, a good scientist shouldn't become scientistic and say, our perspective is the perspective. That, to me, just is not to pay attention to the history and the practice of science. So you can't ultimately defend science. Think about it. How would you do it? Well, I'll run some scientific experiments and gather some scientific evidence. Well, that's to presuppose that science is in some sense legitimate. Well, I'll offer an argument for it, you know, like in the philosophy of science. Well, what would that argument do other than presuppose the self-correcting nature of reason that science tries to participate in? And this is Schindler's point, right? If you're not willing to acknowledge the ecstatic nature of reason, then nothing I can say will actually refute your criticisms of me. Now, this is a very dangerous thing to say because you don't want people to just invoke it so that they don't have to defend their claims or so that they don't have to enter into discussion with you. In fact, they are only invoking it legitimately if they are precisely willing to talk with you, to dialogue with you, to argue with you.
Yeah, that's I've heard you talk about that before. It's quite interesting that science, it's a very useful tool, but it cannot justify its own existence in some ways.
It, not only can it not justify currently, and up till now, it has been unable to explain its own existence. We don't have a scientific explanation for how we generate scientific
science.
explanations. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or what kind of beings we have to be in order to be able to do that, or how the world ultimately has to be structured so that math and science work about, like, not that we're not making progress on any of these questions, but notice what I want to say here. We have no conclusive thing to say about them. And I think it's quite plausible that we never will if we really understand. And so we have to get to this place where we understand that science is not just another perspective in one sense, but in another sense, it is. And we have to hold those two together in a very careful relationship.
It's interesting that science itself, I mean, it really is inquiry, I guess, right? It is this systematic way of questioning or engaging in dialogue with reality to some extent. And it, you know, I keep, what comes up for me again, there's the market process being irreducible. The market is this process or this forum of inquiry, you know, and you can't get beneath that in the economic sciences. It's like the atom of economics, if you will. It's just the market. No matter where you go, you hit the market. And just interesting to me. You can't, I don't know, there's no answer for that. It's like, why is there a market? Why is there trade occurring?
Yes.
You know, anyways, I want to double click on something you just said there. You mentioned adverbially, verbally versus adjectivally.
Yes.
And I've heard you use those two terms too. I think it was in describing the pure consciousness experience.
Yes. Yes.
Where you there's different.
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe you could just expand upon that a bit. I've just heard you mention it. I don't know a lot about it.
Okay. Oh, okay. So,
I know that's a detour. We don't have to take it if you don't want. I'm just wondering if there's some connection.
no, I'll take it because it might actually be helpful later. I have an intuition that your introduction of it is not just right, you know, tangential or digressive. I think you are reaching for something that might afford us some tools we can use to explain other things. So the pure consciousness event is a state that is realized. It was sort of brought to the fore by Foreman, but it's a state that's realized. I've realized it by many people in deep and extended meditative practice. And there's an explanation, a good explanation. I try to offer it in conjunction with other people's work of what's going on in that, in terms of how we can step back and look at our perspectives, and then we can step back and and then what it entails is you're conscious, not of anything. You're not even conscious of consciousness. You're just conscious. And you can get a little taste of it and try and answer as instantaneously as you can. Are you conscious right now?
Yes.
And how do you know you're conscious? By being conscious.
Yeah.
By being conscious. The knowing and the being, like, this is perfect participatory knowing. The knowing, right? The knowing that you're conscious and being conscious are not separables. So just being conscious, right, is a possibility for you. So you're just in the pure consciousness. So you're not aware of any adjectives. You're not aware of blue or green or any categories that could be predicated, like it's a dog or it's a cat or it's big or it's small. So that's all the adjectival stuff goes away. But you don't black out. You don't black out. So there is something there when all of these adjectival properties are lost. What's there is what I argue is actually essential to consciousness. Because what the pure consciousness event shows, I would argue, with Foreman and others, is that a lot of the stuff that philosophers get hung up about, you know, about what's the greenness of green, and right, the hard problem of qualia, which, by the way, is important. But one of the points that I want to make is that is presupposing that those are essential features of consciousness, that they're necessary and sufficient for being consciousness, for being conscious. And the pure consciousness event shows you that those qualia are not necessary. They can be absent, and yet you are still conscious. I think there are other things that show that the adjectival qualia are not sufficient. And because they're neither necessary nor sufficient, we can't make a claim of them being at least analytically necessary. Now, what remains are adverbial qualia, the here-ness, the sense of here-ness. And that's the sense of presence. You don't disappear, right? There's the now-ness, which becomes almost absolute in a sense of eternity. And then the togetherness, right, of your experience, which is often articulated again as kind of an absolute oneness or unity. So all the adverbial qualia remain. Now, I'm not going to do it here. I've done it elsewhere. And if you want to see it in depth, you can watch Untangling the World Not series that I did with Greg Enriquez. But all of those properties, I would argue, those adverbial properties, can be understood in terms of relevance realization and intentional processes therein that, right, make a very strong case for being able to do things at the same time. Explain what consciousness is fundamentally doing. It's not painting mental pictures. It's fundamentally helping us do relevance realization in situations that are high in ill-definedness, novelty, and complexity. But that functionality is precisely bound to this very basic kind of phenomenology, this here-ness and nowness and togetherness that survives even in the pure consciousness event. And that means we can start to join the function of consciousness to the phenomenal nature of consciousness. And we can start to answer both, what does consciousness do, and what kind of thing is consciousness? And so I think that's really, really important. Now, if you'll allow me, I think this does move back to, right, something that is relevant to Plato, because if you, and notice I'm using realize in this really, really participatory sense. If you realize the ground of consciousness, this sort of the pure being of awareness in the pure consciousness event, you can also understand that there is something that, right, is resonant with that about the pure being. So behind all the thoughts and all the concepts and even all the predicates and all the adjectives is the pure being, right? The pure being of pure consciousness. Is that okay? And then
the pre-intellectual cutting edge.
Yes, and that is exactly one with, not logically identical to, but one with the pure being that is behind all the things and their relations, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get non-duality. You get the reciprocal opening between the ground of the psyche and the ground of the world. And they are both participating in, because they're resonating with each other, the pure being that Plato is talking about. And I think, and this becomes very clear in Neoplatonism, this non-duality that's also spoken about convergently, not logically identically, but convergently in Vedanta, in Buddhism, and in Taoism. And so there's something fundamental being disclosed. Now, when people have these, they describe these as the really real, Plato's exact term, the really real, the realization of the really real, or as Nishitani puts it, the self-realization of the really real, which is that his definition for religion, right? The binding. Now, they're not proving any claim of reality. What they're claiming is to have to realize, to be fully participating in that which cannot be demonstrated precisely because it is the ground field of all possible sense-making, perception, conception. And again, if you haven't gone there, or at least even felt yourself moving in that trajectory, this will fall on many people's ears, like Socrates talking about the sun in the cave. It's like, oh, that's all ridiculous. That makes no sense. That's mumbo jumbo. That's navel gazing, until it happens to you. And then you go, oh, crap. But I can make exactly the same argument to somebody who has never been in love. Oh, that's all just wishy-washy thinking, blah, blah, blah. And then they go through it and they go, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Right.
Yeah.
And so you have to be careful about this. I acknowledge that. But the digression, I think, actually gives us another kind of language drawn in some interesting way, both from cognitive science and from the mystical traditions, about talking about what Plato was talking about.
Yeah, this it's almost funny in a way. It's like, how many reels can you get into one phrase? And that's most closely mapped to reality. But this really, really real that we're talking about. I mean, I don't know that I've experienced the pure consciousness event per se, but in meditation, you get to a place that is transcendent, deeply unified, good. And it seems to be, my own personal experience at least, it's a wellspring of creativity. Like, you go into this thoughtless dimension, but as you come out, or even sometimes when you're there, like, these really profound thoughts will come to you. And it's funny, when we wrapped up yesterday, I went for a swim. I'm here in Kauai. I went and swam in the ocean, and I'm doing a freestyle. So every 3 strokes, I tilt my head left to take a breath and tilt my head right and repeat. And when I would tilt my head right, I would have the sun on my face, and we talked so much about the sun analogy yesterday, and the feeling of the sun on your body. Like, it's probably the closest thing in terms of goodness that you can experience deep in meditation. They seem like they're related somehow. I don't know. And the relationship would be explicated here, but I had never made that connection before in my life. And then the other way, I mean, you said something yesterday too, where when you come to realize that the sun is what energizes and animates your very biology that is making this ascent towards the good, it's really
possible.
It's a revelation of sorts. But back on this adverbial and adjectival, so we're becoming this place then where becoming, deep in meditation, where becoming and being seem to converge. Or the relative and the absolute seem to converge. This is then akin, I guess the adverbial is akin somehow to the absolute, because you still have the adverbs when you have this pure consciousness event.
It is, because
but the adjectives are more, they pertain more to the becoming, right? The relativity.
And sort of distinguishing in speech the different aspects and perspectives, as we should, by the way. Again, as Schindler says, Plato cares about the excellence and the care of words. But the adverbial is ultimately, again, only something you can enact and participate in, right? It's not something you can speak. It can be your manner of speaking, but it can't be something you speak. Now, of course, we speak adverbs, but then what we're doing is we're not actually exemplifying them. To exemplify something adverbially, you move into some kind of participation, often transformative, because the adverb represents some kind of development, some kind of unfolding.
This is the, I'm sorry, correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is the Is-Ness, right? And we use it, like is probably one of the most commonly used words. And so it's pervasive in our language, but it's so fundamental that when you try to ask someone to define the word is, like, it's pretty difficult, actually.
But what's interesting is that's exactly the term Huxley uses in The Doors of Perception to talk about his experience on mescaline, right? He said there was all this is-ness, right? But he's not pointing to is a cat, is a dog. He's pointing to what is presupposed by pointing. Let me try and do this. Okay, so I can be adjectival. This is a pencil. This is a TV remote, right? Or I can do what's called demonstrative reference, where I'm not making an adjectival claim about it. I'm drawing your attention to it and making it salient to you. So I can go this, 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 this. There's no category. In fact, and this is a point made by Zen and Volition, you need that sort of attentional analog to demonstrative reference in order to categorize. In order to categorize, I have to bind things together in co-salience. This, and then you can form a category. The category depends on the thising, the ising of things. Is this making any sense?
Is this related to mathematics somehow? Because I'm thinking,
Well, it's
zero is the category for no category, basically. So it's kind of like the Is-Ness. And then what you just did, you held up three things, said this, and then you can make a category. And math is just like one of the most fundamental categorizations.
So maybe insofar as the zero points to the no thingness that can bind these things together, so I can start to categorize them, then I think we're pointing towards something. Now, what's interesting about this is this can be shown experimentally. So Volition did work with what's called multiple object tracking. So imagine a computer screen and you have like red X's and green squares and purple zeros, and they're all moving around. And what you're doing, and notice how this is so primordial as hunter-gatherers, right? But you're tracking where these things are moving. Like the red circle starts out here, and I'll ask you at some point, where's the red circle now? And you go there, right? Now, you can actually track up to about 8 things, which is really kind of cool if you think about it. But when you max out the tracking, you lose all of the adjectives. Think about how this relates to the pure consciousness event. So what will happen is this started out as a red circle, and it moved, and it will become in between a green square, and now it's a purple rectangle. And I'll ask you, where's the red circle now? And you'll point to it, but you will have no knowledge that it's changed from a red circle into a purple rectangle. All you have is the here-ness, now-ness, togetherness through line. You don't have, right? And that's the ability to track and to trace and to find the through line and to group that makes categorization possible. But notice that it is absolutely just about here-ness, now-ness, and togetherness. The pure consciousness event is just moving into that demonstrative reference state that's at the core of our attentional engagement to the world. Did that help?
Yeah, it did. So there's a trade-off then that's occurring where you get more quantity of tracing these things, but you give up the qualia of the individual things you're tracking.
Yes.
Wow.
And what you get to is the basic ability to draw them into co-relevance and co-salience so that you can start even the most basic categorization of them. And that is how you start to bring out their aspects and their properties, etc., etc. And the point, therefore, of that, and this is again what I'm trying to show you, is the pure consciousness event. Yes, it's something that you can get a sense of, or you can even realize in pure meditation, but it's not navel gazing. It's in the guts of how you are attending to the world right now. But it is so transparent to you because the framing of it is so primordial that you take it absolutely for granted.
Wow. Yeah, it's incredible. And it seems like, as you mentioned with Mr. Huxley, that psychedelics operate on that quite profoundly.
They turn the salience landscaping, the salience enhancing, the salience tagging function of consciousness onto that very process of ising. It's like it becomes completely reflective. Your salience tagging, your ability to salience tag.
Wow, that is amazing.
So Robert, I was wondering if I could read a quote, because I think it brings everything we just said back to Schindler's text, and it's right on the page where you're at, 237.
Please.
Okay. The mode of knowledge that Plato indicates here is genuinely absolute. It is not the soul's possession of a thing, and so it is not a conceptual content that can be verbally formulated, but it is rather the soul dwelling with the being of the thing itself, a relation that precisely because it transcends verbal formulation provides in fact the only genuine basis for one's words. So notice again the shifting between the having and the being modes, and notice how what I was trying to do with the multiple object tracking, I was trying to give you what lies beneath your capacity to categorize things is not something that can be, right, that can be categorically spoken of, but you have to be with it, right? And you're literally being with the through line of the object, and it's adverbially conjoined to it, bound to its here-ness, its now-ness, its togetherness. But that ability to ratio religio, right, is what makes what gives you the ability to bind things together in a field of intelligibility so that categorization and therefore speech is made possible. That's what is going on in that passage I just read to you from Schindler.
Yeah, that connects for me well then. So the actual tracing of those individual elements on the screen is your being with them, or your indwelling in them.
Yes,
So
exactly.
It's again back to this empathy being the path to real understanding, right? You have to empathize with a little dot and actually you feel it, right? You feel where it's at, and therefore you can trace 8 of them at a time or whatever it is. I'll actually read a little bit further than what you just read. And he goes on to write, there's an incredible tension here. The heart of the matter is what is most vulnerable, precisely what is most important, cannot be said.
Yeah.
And if it cannot be said, one can never give a fully adequate description of it or argument for it, at least not in words alone. We are reminded of Socrates' reticence for speaking about the idea of the good with precision at the very moment when he says precision is most necessary. It is the very nature of what is ultimate to be ultimately defenseless.
Yeah.
And this herein is the chapter title, The Truth is Defenseless.
Yes.
Yes. And the way I thought about this is like, okay, clearly whatever we're saying here, the capital T truth is beyond words, beyond logic, beyond anything relativistic whatsoever. So by that token, it makes sense. You can't defend it in words, right? You can approach it, I guess, in argumentation, but you can't mount a defense for something that's beyond words and words.
Yes. I would modify that in only in one way, which I don't think you'll disagree with. The truth is beyond, but it's also between and within.
Yes.
Because there's also the withinning of words that is not in the words, right? What is between words ultimately isn't words. And we need to stop and think about that. There's the gestalting of the words that's not any word, right? That may, right? Oh, well, that's the sentence, but you're just repeating the point I'm trying to make, right? And so as long as you don't get sort of a two worlds thing going where the truth is out there, because what somebody might say, well, if it's always completely beyond, you have no way of knowing about it, and they can be dismissive. But if you realize that it's not only beyond, but between and within, which is Plato's point and Schindler's point, then your dismissing of it is a performative contradiction. So you, right, and that's what I was trying to show with the multiple object tracking. Wow, all this pure, but look, it's actually fundamental to every act of attention and perception that you're engaging in. The most concrete guts of your experience, it's also there in a profoundly demonstrable way. And so by putting the two together, it is what you just said. I'm not denying that. It is beyond, but it is also within and between, right? That is also not captured by our words, because it is precisely the non-word binding the words together, and the transformation of our representations that is not itself a representation, etc., etc., etc.
It's the silence between the notes in music, right?
Yes, yes. But the ratio religio silence that makes them into a melody. Yes, exactly. And so notice the melody is both interpolated in the notes as well as extrapolated beyond the notes, if I can put it that way, to build on what we're just saying here. It's the through line is both within, like interpolation, right, with data points, but it is also forever beyond, like the proper extrapolation.
Yeah, it's I don't know, the intuition I have is that we keep coming back to like this window into the void as somehow the ground stuff, you know.
Yes.
I don't even know if it's non-being per se. It's because non-being implies a duality with being. It's something right below that. That's the true no thingness, I guess.
Yes. And exactly the point. When you sort of do this outreach, the ecstasis, while you're reaching, it's you've realized that your reach somehow bends around, underneath you, and it's like, whoa, how did that happen?
You're reaching out and you end up scratching the back of your own head.
yeah, very much.
That's funny.
Now I'd like to tell you about a great new Bitcoin show on the scene that you've got to check out. Brought to you by Swan Studios and Bitcoin Magazine, this show is Hard Money with Natalie Brunell. Natalie is an Emmy-nominated journalist bringing unparalleled experience to the Bitcoin media scene. And personally, Natalie is one of my favorite voices in the Bitcoin space. Each week on Hard Money, you'll get the top headlines of the week with analysis you won't find anywhere else. Hard-hitting interviews with amazing guests like myself and other top minds in the Bitcoin space. And the show will take you directly into the lives being changed by Bitcoin all over the world. Check out Hard Money at swan.com/hard money. Today, I want to tell you about our sponsor, CrowdHealth. So, how does health insurance work? You send an egregious amount of money to an insurance company. They hold it in a pool of depreciating fiat currency. Then, when you have a large health event, you have to pay them even more via your deductible. And then you hope they will cover your bill. And in fact, 1 in 6 bills are denied by healthcare.gov plans. It's time to take control of your own healthcare bills. I'd like to introduce you to CrowdHealth. It's a decentralization of healthcare using Bitcoin as an alternative to health insurance. Instead of sending fiat currency to a big corporation, you send that money to an account controlled by you, a portion of which is converted into Bitcoin. Then, if you have a big health event, you have a community of Bitcoiners that will use the money in their accounts to help you out. To get more details, go to joincrowdhealth.com/breedlove, where you can find the promo code for $99 a month for 6 months.
Okay, I'm going to read something at the bottom of 238 here.
Sure.
Starting in the middle of the sentence, but Schindler writes, "A modest silence about the heart of things is no false modesty, but a modesty that acknowledges what it means for something to be true in a more than relative sense. In this respect, letter 7 provides a decisive confirmation of our interpretation of goodness as the cause of truth. A thing is true because it exists in itself in a manner irreducible to its relations. And this is just what it means to participate in absolute goodness."
Right.
So obviously, okay, I've mentioned a million times about the market thing being irreducible, but a different aspect on this is emergent properties themselves.
Yes.
That you can't take an emergent property and decompose it into its relations.
That's right.
Somehow it's more than the sum of its parts.
Yes.
So I don't know. That just came up for me here. I just going over to you.
But that brings up what we talked about before. Emergence without emanation is just epiphenomenalism, right? Which means it's always emergence and emanation. As you reach out, there's something about reality that is twisting it back around behind you, like we just said, right? So, right, and this is what we've been talking about before. This structure of intelligibility, the procession and the return in simultaneity, the scientia intuitiva, is the moment when you are participating in this non-logical, non-conceptual identity between truth and goodness. That's what's basically being said here, because I'm only I'm only getting at the truth of something if I am seeing how it is beyond all the ways it is bound to my egocentric perspective. We all know that in one intuitive sense, but when you really try to cash that out, like Plato's doing and Schindler's doing on Plato's behalf, it gets us into what we're talking about right now. It gets us into this, oh, well, yeah, right. Out of all of these things, something emerges. Out of all the words, a sense emerges that's not reducible to them, right? But yet that overall sense disambiguates the words. Remember, we were talking about the simultaneous bottom up and top down of reading, the legibility. Well, the legibility and intelligibility, by the way, they have shared root, shared etymological root. Right. The word intelligence actually means to read between the lines. Think about that. Think about that. Yeah. Interleisure, right? To read between the lines. And so picking up on this is exactly right, as long as you remember, and it's like the movement we just made about, right? The going out is always right. The rising up is also the shining down, to use a whole bunch of different metaphors together. And notice that we would not be talking about any of this if we thought that rationality was just computational rationality, or even worse, if we thought it was just communicative rhetoric. But when we move to this, we start to unpack what must we be like, what must the world be like, and how must we be participating in the world such that an intelligibility is itself possible. And that is the core Platonic question.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it makes sense that it all, not all, but it comes back to justice a lot, right? The question of justice. I mean, I was thinking even in the Newtonian sense, which is like quite low resolution of a model we know now, but for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Like a lot of these things we're describing sound like that.
Yes,
just in a lower resolution, which would be some form of basic cosmological justice, perhaps, right? For every action, there's equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah, I think that was something that was actually voiced explicitly by some of the pre-Socratic philosophers. They were trying to get the sense of the reciprocity between things as somehow fundamental. And what's interesting about that is that Iris Murdoch in The Sovereignty of the Good, by the way, another book I recommend to you.
It's on the list. I got it already.
Okay. And she talks about the core of justice is to treat things as they deserve, to ratio religio to them in terms of not only how they are relevant to you, but again, right, how you are, right, relevant to them, affording their disclosure. And so she calls that sort of that attentional ratio religio is actually the fundamental move of justice, to give things the attention they deserve, both quantitatively and qualitatively, is the core of ethics, especially of justice. And notice how we have the just, right? I'm just seeing this, or I'm adjusting. Like that's in our language, even about how we are relating to things. And I believe there's some etymological relationship there. Maybe I got that from Murdoch. My memory might be failing me here. But so it's not only that reciprocity between things, but again, like we've talked about, that reciprocity between us and the reciprocity of things. And I wonder about how much we are driven by that without acknowledging it. Because what the internet and social media is doing is, I'll play with some of your language, and if I do it incorrectly, please say something. But it's sort of revealing attention. We talk about paying attention as the fundamental currency of social media, and yet we are not bringing any reflection to about how we have a deep epistemic and moral and aesthetic obligation to paying attention in the right way. And so we are enacting the centrality of our attentional ratio religio without explicating it and then trying to acknowledge and properly appreciate it and educate it.
Yeah, I've been thinking I need to read a lot more about attention, but it seems like you could boil down. Well, here's one way to look at it. In economics, we often talk about supply and demand, right? It's very, very common. But you could also reduce that to satisfaction and desire.
Right.
Because it's ultimately just the demand is desire, right? People have desires they want fulfilled, and then supply, right, of goods, capital, services, they satisfy those desires, basically. So the entire economic system, in a way, you could think of as a giant system for allocating our attention, right? We're trying to allocate our attention to the desires those with the wherewithal to pay want satisfied.
Right.
So it gets, and that's what the division of labor essentially is, which I'm sure you've heard about from like Adam Smith, but you just have a longer production process with more individual attention focused on increasingly smaller segments of that production process. So another way of saying that's greater specialization. Yes. And it's through that iterative process of greater specialization and longer production structures that involve more people that we increase standards of living, we increase capital accumulation. So it's the more finely we allocate our attention, the more precisely we allocate our attention, perhaps. And again, to try and tie this together, this is again just kind of me speculating, but we talked earlier about how property is this relationship between owner and asset. It is the fundamental institution that makes this whole economic system work. If you don't have property, then you don't get the economic system, basically. And to the degree you don't have property is to the degree you don't have the economic system. Another way to describe property, though, is I think this is Locke, maybe. We combine our labor with nature.
Yeah, it's a participatory theory.
Yeah, it's participatory. Yeah. So you're expropriating ultimately from nature through work, right? You're cutting down the trees to build a house or whatever it may be. But what you were saying here, where it's this idea of properly apportioning attention, property is kind of doing that in that you're giving people, or you said justice is what giving people or giving things what they deserve, I think.
The proper proportioning of it.
Yeah, what someone deserves is like the fruits of their labor, right? If they went out and built the house, well, they deserve to have the rights and the responsibility. It's very key. We always talk about property rights, but we ignore the other side of the coin, which is responsibility. You have to maintain the house, you have to insure the house, you have to protect the house, etc. That seems to be very essential to the justice at the heart of civilization itself. And there's a number of ways I could take this. Ayn Rand often describe, and not just Ayn Rand, Mises, lots of economists say private property is essentially the basis of civilization. If you don't have it, you're not going to have a civilization. In the same way, if you don't have that economic system, then you're going to have people fighting over the stuff versus just making the stuff, right? And then the other thing I would say to connect it to justice is that the entire justice system itself, the rule of law, grounds out in private property. It exists exclusively to resolve disputes over scarce resources, ultimately. So it's just interesting to me that there's this idea of properly apportioning our attention, but also properly, I guess, awarding and penalizing people based on their behavior. Like this is all very intrinsic to the notion of justice and the justice system more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know. There's so many things. The justice system, it does exist to resolve disputes, but I would argue that it also exists, right? So there's people who argue about the symbolic function of the legal system. The legal system also tries to indicate to you what we care about or what we find important or salient in a society. And I think that's also an important function here of the way it's directing our attention. It's saying, you know, this is important. And this is not, right? There's no serious legislation trying to limit the number of flavors of ice cream, for example, or something like that. It's like, well, why does that? That's not that important. But, you know, we put out serious legislation, you know, for, you know, hitting somebody or harming them, well, because a person is important. And I can see how that overlaps with what you're saying about property, but
I should add there, because it's person and property. Basically,
yeah.
If it's owner and asset, your body is your most, your inalienable property. You can't trade away your body, right? Like your cognitive faculties in your body are kind of inextricably bound up. So it does encompass both of those things. I just wanted to let you know that.
No, that's good. I'm just asking you what you think about the idea of law as also directing our attention, making things salient and making constant claims about the relative importance of things in our society.
I would,
because one of the reasons of, well, according to this view, one of the reasons why we punish people is not just to rehabilitate them or to, you know, or to deter other crime. It's a way of saying to everybody, this is important. This is important. Because we also have things that are not, you know, forbidden. There's also things that are promoted in some sense, you know, around the law, you know, things that we consider important to do, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I would struggle to come up with an example myself that didn't somehow ground out in property and that general understanding. Even when you're describing punishing someone, right? Presumably they violated someone's property. Like what else did they get in trouble for? They either stole from someone or hurt someone or broke a law of some kind. This is, you know, the natural law ethic. It grounds out in this single dictum, which is do not steal. But do not steal can be expanded into, you know, do not hurt others, right? To kill someone as to steal someone's life, for instance. So
right. I'm not denying any of that. I'm trying to get, in addition to do not steal, which, if you'll allow me some Christian language, is Old Testament. There's the New Testament, love your neighbor as yourself, which isn't the same as don't harm them, don't steal. It's right. It's that treat them as important as you consider your own importance, or, you know, love the Lord your God with all your heart and science. You can't really make a law about that, even though it's a commandment. You know,
right.
That's what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to get at those things that are kind of trans-legal, in that they try to tell us what we should consider important, what we should pay attention to, sort of above and beyond how we're trying to, I don't know what I want to say here, you know, get along with people or live together in civilization. I'm struggling here, but I'm trying to get
is it a like legislating of morality type question? Or
well, I think I've made a mistake, because I think what I'm trying to point to, and maybe this is again Schindler, I think legislation is where morality goes when it's becoming relative to a particular system or nation or culture, and then we try to rise above that when we try to think about how we bind that culture to reality itself, which is not something that can be given or demonstrated by the law. Yeah, here's the analogy. Like the laws of the culture can't ground the laws of the, we can't make any law about that because there has to be something that binds that too, right? You see what I'm trying, this is exactly analogous to what we've been talking about before. Like there's something that's meta legal that has to bind these all together. I'm trying to suggest to you that the market is not only sort of specializing down and then dealing with all the interactions, right? It's also reaching up in that I take it that it also, I'm trying to say something like it represents our cultural aspirations and the ways in which we try to bind a particular culture to a particular environment, to a particular nation state, etc. Did that make any sense? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, so two things came up for me. One would be this meta legal grounding, perhaps you're talking about. I think that is where we get into religion, right? Or ideology. There has to be some grounding below the legal system that's, making certain assumptions about standard operating behavior, something to that effect.
Something like a worldview that binds agents and arenas together so that moral codes and legal codes and aesthetic codes can be operating. But those rules and those codes can't ground themselves. They are meaning systems. But yeah, this is what Gertz says religion does. It's the meta meaning system that's doing that. I guess that's a good way of putting it. So my question becomes maybe this. Does the law sometimes try to mediate or moderate between, what the market is doing and the meta meaning of culture that religion is doing? Is it sometimes doing that as well?
I don't know the answer. I mean, the way I understand it today is that basically life, liberty, and property are the principles, right? Go out, live your life free, create as much value as you want, trade with other people that are self-owned doing the same thing. And then through that division of labor, we create more wealth. But inevitably, that whole thing, the whole system of trade, by the way, exists to not resolve conflict over scarce resources, but to reduce scarcity itself, right? We're actually increasing economic abundance, reducing scarcity. But in the event there is some irreconcilable difference between two market actors and they can't come to terms, whatever it is, right? I think I own the house. You said you built the house. Then we have recourse to some coercive apparatus, right? The political legal apparatus that we can actually go and then adjudicate the agreement that we had. So I'm not sure, maybe I'm thinking about it too mechanically, and that I'm not.
Let me try and do it more concretely then. And this actually relates, and then I think we can maybe swing back to Schindler through this. I'm thinking about laws against treason. They don't make any sense because, right, if you were bound to the legal system, you wouldn't commit treason, and yet you're making a law within the legal system in which you're trying to say you have to love this system. But do you see what I'm trying to get at? What are we punishing somebody for in treason? We're sort of punishing them for not agreeing to the fundamental commitment and love that binds everyone to the system.
There's I think it was Hirachi, might be a different poet, but he talks about the oldest lie. Have you ever heard this?
No.
There's a long poem, but the punchline of the poem is that the oldest lie in history is that it is a noble thing to die for your country.
Right.
And so he's making this whole point that it's not, and it's kind of a point I wanted to get to later, that I think nationalism, I have a good question about this later, but basically I think it might just be a intermediate phase of human history, because it doesn't, the question you just asked, to commit treason, what does that mean? It's like you went and informed some other legal system at the expense of this legal system. Yes. And now you've hurt your country, whatever that means. So, I don't know. It's very hard to talk about this, and Plato's a great example of this? Because I feel like we're in the
Yes.
cave, like we're in the cave of
Yes.
statism, trying to talk
Yes.
about
Yes.
how to get out of the
Oh,
cave, but we
that's
can
well
only
said.
speak the language of our statist history.
I was talking with John Stewart, and he just released a video, and he's talking about the arc of biological evolution as you go through stages of there's competition, and then it resolves into collaboration and integration. You have the unicellular organisms become the multicellular, and then the multicellular organisms become communities, and etc. And he was proposing something like that. He was proposing that that he's not saying there's a teleology to evolution, but he's saying that every time, like, you can point to what keeps getting selected for in evolution is the ability to move to a higher unity. He calls it entification, the emergence of a new entity. And it sounds like to me like you're proposing something very similar to that.
I think that's what Bitcoiners, well, that's what we would hope Bitcoin would become, right? Is a deeper unity amongst humanity that would transcend nationalism. And that doesn't mean you can't still have nations, but the nation state as this dominant organizational model or institution in the world today, it only got that way because it has the monopoly on money. So
Right.
very simple. Another way to think about this, I hope it lands, but essentially, roughly speaking, every human organization is a business, right? It's trying to accomplish some aim. It needs to have more economic inflows than outflows to be sustainable. Otherwise, it goes away. So said another way, every human organization that is a business is accountable to its profit and loss statement. It has to generate profits to survive, just like you have to have a caloric surplus to survive, as an organism. Well,
Right.
the exception to that is any institution that monopolizes money, because now they can just print money to steal from everyone else and basically survive in perpetuity until that currency collapses. And so this has been something we've been locked in throughout human history. It's like monopoly on violence is established to preserve peace. They always monopolize money as well, because it's essentially unlimited revenue to the point of hyperinflation. And then the currency gets debased, or the coins get clipped in the case of ancient civilizations, to the point of the currency not working anymore. The binding has been dissolved, right? The binding of civilization gets literally inflated and dissolved, debased, and then civilization falls apart and reorganizes and starts over. So this description you're saying towards higher unification, I think, is what the hope that Bitcoiners have for Bitcoin is, to be a form of unity transcendent to nationalism, I guess.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'm going to try and bring it back to Plato and Schindler by saying one thing, and then maybe we can return to your selections from the text that you'd like to discuss, because we are running out of time. But I thought that was very good. But just one more sort of final thought, and hopes that it sounds to me in the end that we are back to Murdoch's point, though, that we are not paying attention to money in the right way and not realizing it for what it is, as at the core of your argument.
Yes, yeah. One of two things: either we've underestimated the importance of money, or or Bitcoin is more than money, I guess would be the other way to look at it.
Right.
It's like it's a new social institution.
That's really interesting. It's really interesting, because you've made a move. Instead of talking about the just disposition of money, you're now talking about the just apprehension of money as being more fundamental than the first thing I just said, which has been typically how we have talked about it. Do you see what I'm trying to say? We've talked about justice in terms of, we have this and how do we dispose of these funds? And you're saying that, you're not denying that that's important, but you're saying, at least I'm hearing you say, but what's much more fundamental is the just apprehension and attending to money, because that, right, if you get that wrong, it messes up the second in a dramatic way. Have I treated your argument fairly?
Yeah, I think you have. And it's, the common conception today is that you have layer one, which is government, and then layer two, your government issues your money, right? But that's not the reality of how we got to governments and money. The reality is we settled down to become agriculturalists. I think it was to get drunk, by the way, not to eat food. I think we liked producing wine and beer, so we decided to settle down. And then we started to create an economic surplus or savings, and we're trading with one another. To protect that economic surplus or savings, you need the institution of government. So it was trade and money that emerged first. Trade and money, like money is an emergent property of trade. So that exists before government. And then government, as a monopolist on force, always tries to monopolize the money because that's the path of least resistance to control populations, frankly, and tax them.
Yeah.
So if you use a software analogy, I guess one of the ways I'm trying to say this is that money is like the base layer operating system of human action, maybe something akin to religion, actually. And it's not any coincidence, perhaps, that we have all these religious motifs on our money, right? If I pull out the US dollar right now, it says, "In God we trust," right? There's this, I guess, mythos that needs to be upheld to preserve the integrity of the currency, to preserve trust in the currency.
And the opposite's also the case. We've always used gold in order to make things sacred to us. Right. And so, yeah, that's interesting. You always make me think about the relation. And this is what I meant. And I tried to mean it as like as more than just sort of a label. You're trying to say something about the sacredness of money, which is nothing like the greed to possess as much of it as you can. It's more what we're talking about here. It's having the just apprehension of its reality that is central to the just disposition of particular amounts of money or something like that.
Yes.
That's a very powerful point. I hadn't seen that before in your argument. It's great, eh? When you play in the Platonic Dojo, you often find that you are able to reach things that you couldn't otherwise reach.
Well, for me, walking out of economics and into Plato, especially this whole dichotomy between, well, it's not a dichotomy, but the absolute and the relative, the discussion of that is very interesting because, well, as we said in chapter 1, relativism descends into justified violence, right?
Yes.
That's what fiat currency is there's just a bunch of relativists. You're just, how many dollars is a euro worth? How many euro? Like there's no axiomatic point of absolute reference other than gold. That's what gold is or was. But now gold has sort of, that market has been manipulated in a whole lot of ways. So now we have Bitcoin as like the actual discovery of an absolute money that could be the central pole around which all other economic systems orient themselves. The last thing I'll say here just is coming up. I don't know if you find it interesting or not, but I thought a lot about why money is religious in nature. And I'm not going to try to distill all of the utility of religion, but I think one use of religion is that it lowers the cost of trust. That if you and I are both Christian or we both attend the same church, like we're much more likely to do business together. We're much more likely to go to battle together, whatever it is. I know you share the same values as me. Therefore, trust is very expensive to build and very easy to break. So something like religion can help scale trust. Well, money does something very similar, right? You don't need to trust me necessarily. If I just slide you a bag of gold coins, like you'll go do the thing.
By the way, that is a hypothesis within the cognitive science of how religion may have evolved. I don't think and you didn't claim it either. I don't think it's a complete account by any means, especially given everything we've been talking about. But the idea that one of the things religion does, in fact, they talk about costly display. So I do these things like initiation rites and other things that are quite costly because I'm paying that sort of high personal cost, because what that's basically saying is I deeply commit to the group, and that means you can trust me in a profound way. And that, of course, has all kinds of individual and shared cognitive benefits.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening.
Nice thing to say, by the way. Absolutely.
Thank you for that tangent and entertaining me. I don't know, sometimes I'm sure maybe you've ever felt this way, like you're going down all these rabbit holes and you just don't know if you're crazy or what, but well, it's fun. It's fun to try to identify these commonalities.
I actually was using the dojo analogy a little bit deliberately. You often do these weird things that seem tangential, but when you can go out and then come back to the core, you've often found, oh, wait, that wasn't a waste of time, because that's the looping we've been talking about. I go beyond the art, and as I understand it, and bring something into it that changes me and changes my understanding, and it grows. And that's what I meant about playing in the Platonic dojo. I think it's important. I mean, you have indulged me a lot with trying to carry this into cognitive science, right? And play and show how it does work there. I think it's only fair and right that I allow you to try to bring it into the connections you want to make, and play with it and see if it helps to make things more intelligible, which it seems to be doing, which is again what I mean about the Platonic Neoplatonic framework as of creating the courtyard of dialogue as opposed to the courtroom debate.
Yes. Well, the pleasure is all mine, let me tell you, because I really, really enjoy this process. I will try to read an excerpt here that may be related to that. Let's see. I'm on 248. Schindler writes, the difference between the two conceptions of reason, the philosophical and the sophistical, comes to expression perhaps most directly in the relationship which implies to power.
Yes. According
to both the Republic and the letter 7, as we have interpreted them, reason is ordered to the real being of things, which means it has its terminus in something absolute and irreducible. To put the same point negatively, if a thing were ultimately reducible to its relations, it would no longer possess its own intrinsic being. The verb to be must be totally abolished.
In that situation.
And by the same token, it would not represent an object for reason. Now, towards the end of this section here, he writes, now, one of the implications of reason's reciprocal relation with the absoluteness of being is that reason itself must be in some respect absolute in order to be reason, as ordered to what is absolute. In other words, it cannot be subordinated to anything else within the order of meaning without surrendering its own integral structure. Let me see how much I wanted to read this. Okay, so I get one, just a speculation here. If reason is that which is ordered to the absolute, it seems like the state model is using the absolute of death to order human reason, right? It's the monopoly on violence. So right. It's the threat of force or coercion or death is kind of like the shadow that's guiding us. But in this hypothetical post-state world, perhaps the absolute 21 million of Bitcoin could be like an alternative pillar for human organization, an alternative absolute for human organization rather than the threat of force or death. And I know this sounds kind of maybe crazy, but one of the most interesting things about Bitcoin is when you get into the economics of violence language, or literature rather, and it describes how society, and we talked about this a little bit way back when you told me about the Bronze Age, how there was a sudden collapse. So the punchline there would be the economics of violence tend to contribute to how we organize ourselves.
Yes.
And Bitcoin is basically this property right that's very hard to violate. So it makes coercion and violence and all these things much less profitable over time. So in that lens, perhaps the absolute nature of Bitcoin could be an alternative to the absolute of death that we've used to organize ourselves since time immemorial, basically.
So that's a very interesting proposal. If that were the case, and I'm not saying that if to challenge or dismiss, I'm like, let's take it seriously. Would that so change our participation in distributed cognition and shift, our modal apprehension? Are we less in the having mode because, right, we don't like, would all of those shifts help to shift us to being more rational in the way Plato and Schindler are talking about? Well, what I'm saying is, as we talked about in the first series, currency is a psychotechnology, and it helped to bring about the Axo revolution because it gets internalized into the very cultural grammar of how we think, etc. And then we explore the possibility, if we were to change that and replace it with a different psychotechnology, that would also ultimately percolate into depths of the psyche and also permeate into people's lives. Are you making the argument, or would you like to make the argument, that if we made that change, that might help to realize or bring back or recover this notion of Platonic rationality? Is that an argument you would like to make, or you are making?
Well, I would say at least this, that to the extent lowering our time preference contributes to moving us from the having mode to the being mode.
Right.
I think sound money in general would definitely contribute to that, just because
Yes,
you can save in something that is going to hold its value over time, so you get a longer time horizon.
Okay, so that's good, because towards the end of the book, Schindler returns back to that, right, where he talks about the impulsivity, and we talked about that as mythology having at its core a kind of intellectual impatience. So let me see if I get it right. So we make this change, and then it as I said, it percolates into our psyche, it permeates into our lives, that alters, right, the temporal horizon, and that reduces all of the scarcity and forced threat pressure for us to be very intellectually impatient. And then that opens up the possibility of shifting into the being mode that is central to trying to cultivate ratio religio. That's your argument, right?
Yes. And you've actually hit on something slightly more expansive, that so the lowering the time preference is important, but also giving people an option to get out of inflation and taxation. This is just basically, in the libertarian philosophy, these are forms of theft. So the more you can insulate yourself from theft, the more capital you can accumulate. So you're also moving yourself towards that being mode. You have more freedom, ultimately, more leisure.
Right.
To, I guess, engage in spiritual or artistic pursuits. And the last piece to this that might tie to Plato is the intelligibility of the market is the pricing system, right? And when you print money, you're distorting that. You're putting noise into the channel,
Yes.
communication channel, which is pricing. So sound money would enhance the salience of price signals.
Right.
So you're getting a clearer picture, more wealth, and presumably lower time preference would move towards being mode, I think.
Totally. I mean, scarcity mentality causes people to shorten, right? To engage in more hyperbolic discounting. They lose cognitive flexibility, etc. That's really interesting. That's just a really thought-provoking argument. I did after we had our last discussion, but it's sort of deeper for me now, that there might be a connection between I'm trying to use my words carefully, a proper currency and mythology that I hadn't thought of before, which is very, very interesting proposal.
Yeah, it is. It's a proposal that I'm working on, and I'm glad to hear it resonates with you, because I really respect you as a thinker. And there's a lot of people coming at Bitcoin from a lot of different camps, kind of coming to the same conclusion. And so there's this huge consilience of people that are not like me at all. They're approaching it from a totally different angle, but reaching the same conclusion that, you fix the money, fix the world, as we say in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So who knows? I guess we'll see.
But John Vallis, in some of the discussions with him, and the opposite is the case. It's already having a transformation on people beyond, right? Sort of, I don't know what to call it, their economic life. It's having a spiritual it's led you into this, which is really interesting. And so there is that possibility also. The other side of that, the other side of the coin, I was going to say, which is a bad pun. But the other side, right, is the fact that the way it liberates people's thinking doesn't just stay in that one area. It expands to these other domains. So that's also preliminary evidence for your proposal, that part of it as well.
Yeah, I would say maybe that's a case of the emergence aspect. There's a bottom-up emergence that people are waking up to false realities, maybe, or whatever things that are wrong in the world. But then the emanation is this single unifying idea, right? Of just, one hard money forever for everyone. So maybe there's some confluence occurring there, the emergence and the emanation.
Okay, that was a really it was very.
Let me read this little
digression
passage here. I'm going to continue where we're going, and I there's a little bit of a punchline here that's related to what we're talking about, I think. So I'll continue on 249, and this is kind of a long excerpt on power.
Right.
That I'll read some selections from. Schindler writes, thus, reason must be at the same time more powerful than anything else and essentially powerless itself, if it is to exist as reason at all. The question of the integrity of reason in relation to its own specific work cannot be divorced from the place reason has in the general order of life. If it is given a subordinate role in this order, it will cease to be an absolute means by which the truth of things becomes manifest. In other words, a society in which power trumps reason, things will no longer have a horizon, as it were, against and within which to manifest their intrinsic meaning.
Yes.
He goes on to write, Plato depicts the philosopher as one specifically without a desire for the power implied by political office. And in spite of the perhaps overly optimistic hope he pursued of bringing about a philosophically founded polis in Sicily, he was well known to have kept aloof from politics. There is in Plato's mind an ultimate and exclusive choice to be made. Either one pursues truth, i.e., the intrinsic meaning of things beyond one's control, or one pursues power in some form or another, i.e., the capacity to manipulate things for ends one determines for oneself.
Yes.
Just a few more here. Schindler goes on to write, self-election could be said to be the symbol of the pursuit of power and express in a nutshell why it is the opposite of truth. In contrast to this perfect reduction of the order of things to one's own determination, pure relativity, truth is comprehensive and essentially irreducible to such relativity.
Mm-hmm.
He goes on to write, ultimately, he says, truth and power must coincide, but the only way for them to coincide without eliminating the exclusive alternatives just presented is for the ruling office to be imposed on one who has renounced it. That is, to be a thing received rather than seized. In this way, power becomes not the opponent, but the servant of truth, insofar as it is embraced within the obedience that is intrinsic to reason's ecstatic nature. Almost done here. He goes on to write, the identification of power with explicit office may be seen as connected with sophistry. And he further down, he writes, perhaps the best way to interpret this is that the political dimension of the philosopher's rule takes the form of bringing the authority of the good to bear in the public sphere in a manner appropriate to it. Finally, he writes, to make power a servant of reason rather than the reverse is to transform the meaning of power.
Yes.
So
This is what's behind the famous Platonic argument of the philosopher king.
right. And so, power is kind of a muddied term, but if I look at it in just a physics sense, which is just the capacity to do work over time,
Yes.
which again is what we're doing in the economic process. We're trying to increase our physical power in the world, or
Yes.
our
Yes.
utilization of energy, if you will. Well, Bitcoin is something that makes power a servant of reason rather than the sophistic reverse. So therefore, if he's right, then it's transforming the meaning of power. And now that maybe that probably didn't land, because there's a
No, keep going.
Bitcoin mining is, you're converting energy into money. Basically, there's this open market competition.
Yeah.
You're competing to solve a mathematical puzzle, expending energy to solve the puzzle, and then the winners of that contest are rewarded in Bitcoin.
Right.
It's transforming our relationship with physical power very fundamentally.
Yes.
But it's putting it at the service of reason, which the reason is just like fair and equitable rules for all, right? It's like you can hold a form of property that no one can change. You have an absolute property right to some extent. So it seems like to be an inversion where, and this also seems, maybe this is the purpose of things like the US Constitution, right? We knew that you couldn't put all the power in one place. You had to decentralize it to some extent and have some reasonable mode of resolving itself. So we've been trying to put power under reason for a long time.
Right.
But it just seems like this might be another step forward, I guess, in that respect.
There was two things you said there. So the first is that so Bitcoin is trying to put power in service of reason, because Bitcoin, your other argument has been, it tries to be in service to the reality of what money is, as opposed to just how we can use it relative to our particular goals. That's what I've heard you say repeatedly.
Yes, and you could also say, back to you, we said proper apportionment, or when you described justice earlier, rather, that getting what one deserves, like property is
of attention. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you mentioned some author that said justice is essentially treating something with what it deserves.
The way that's Murdoch. Yes.
Murdoch. So maybe that's the more potent framing for it, is that you can finally have a property that nobody can violate. It's very easy to violate your US dollar bank account property. It's very easy to take your land. It's very easy to seize your business. Governments have done all of this across all of recorded history. But now if you hold Bitcoin, you hold a private key. It's just information. It's a form of property no one can really take from you. So I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to give you that more fundamental sense that it's reason in the sense that it's a pure justice. It takes work to obtain it, and then nobody can take it from you.
And that I get that, but I was trying to. You've also been making an argument, though, that it's an act of disillusionment about what money is. It's removing all kinds of illusions, and to Plato's argument, those illusions empower all kinds of abuse.
Yes.
Right. So it seems to me that's actually more primary, because it's, in one sense, it's protecting you, right? I get what you're saying, but in another sense, more profound sense, right? By orienting us away from certain illusions about what money is and what it's doing. That's the name of your show, in fact. What is money, right? Right. That is binding us in a way so that our power is always bound by a deep realization, and please, you'll know how I'm using that word, of what we need money to be for us, or something like that. But that is also, right, trying to tie into just some fundamental properties that it has to have in and of itself. Like, part of what I hear you saying, and why you keep making the analogy, is, right, there's an in-itself-ness to Bitcoin that we can't mess with, right? That we can't mess with. And that makes us always, we can't reduce it to how is it relevant to me? We always have to always say, but how am I relevant to it? That's what I'm hearing you say. And that would be that the power is always in the service of the right relationship with the reality of the phenomenon. That's what I'm trying to say. Does that land for
Yes.
you?
Yes, it does. It's I don't want to sound too wild, but it's pure justice, right? Or it's pure symmetry. Maybe I'm gonna take a stab and jump forward and read an excerpt that I also wrote something. You got me really excited now that your wheels are turning on Bitcoin. So now I want to jump to all my Bitcoin excerpts and read them to you. Okay. So I jumped to page 264, and Schindler writes, the reason image making is so quick is that it involves no real difficulty. And it involves no difficulty essentially because it is superficial. It does not seek to get to the core of things, but is content to capture how they appear.
Yes.
Now, I would analogize image making to this idea of counterfeiting currency or inflating the currency. That you're just making new images, more dollars, right? Control P, there's 600 trillion new US dollars in the economy. There's no new factories, no new equipment, no new knowledge. We just increase the money supply. So it's image making, right? In its most extreme sense. And
right. It's making the appearance super salient so that it excludes the reality. That's what I hear you say.
Yes.
It's bullshit. It's bullshit. In a profound way. Yes.
Bullshit. And in Bitcoin, we would say, we call this proof of work, right? You have to have proof of work to create new money. That's what mining gold was. That's what mining Bitcoin is.
Right.
So when you get into just money that's image making or just fiat that can just be printed, if there's no work necessary to produce that, then it's being used to steal the work of others.
So you're making the claim that a lot of our currency is, Baudrillard's simulacra. It's a simulation, but there's no origin that the simulation is attached to. Like, and that's Plato's concern when we get images of images of images.
Yes.
We get in the hyper, what's called the hyper real. I don't like that term. I think it's a bad term, but
hyper reality.
Yeah, but that's because I think it should be used in a totally different way. But nevertheless, right, this idea of this removal, and we're sort of spun in this thing that is not connected.
Yes, and I'll just read this one last part for you.
No, I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding you. That's all.
No, you're right on. He goes on to write, the reason for the ease and speed of sophistic image making, such as Plato presents it, is due to an indifference to reality.
Right. That's the core of bullshit. Yeah. That's the core of bullshit. The indifference to the truth. Yes.
But if image making is easy, the good by its nature is by nature hard. In the Sophist, Plato explains that appearances in argument are corrected by actual relations to things suffered in experience over time. And he goes on to write, like love, patience is essentially relational or intentional. If knowledge requires transcendence of self, as we have argued, then real knowledge cannot come quickly. Yeah. So there's this term in economics called easy money and hard money. Easy money is the fiat that you just control P and create more of, and hard money is honest money. It's gold, right? It's Bitcoin. You have to actually expend energy to earn the energy that money is a claim to.
Right.
So this seemed like a really loud way of Plato annihilating the concept of fiat currency and highlighting the importance of proof of work.
That's a powerful argument. I think it's an insightful application. I've never seen this. Plato is typically applied to science or to religion or to theology or to art or even to our romantic relationships or friendship, all very powerfully. But you're making an argument about trying to make use of Platonic arguments in order to deeply distinguish Bitcoin from fiat currency. I don't have anything other to say to like what I'm just trying to understand it and explicate it and bring it out. So do you, again, I guess the one question that's similar to the question I asked before, if that and I don't want to sound like a crypto Marxist or anything like that, but like if that fundamental economic relationship is changed, it's plausible that that would also transfer back to these other domains where we see this Platonic framework also being applied. Because for me, that would be the existential, what to call it, proof of concept of your argument, right? If it starts to bleed, like we said, if it starts to reduce nosology, if it makes people more patient in general, if it tutors them to not go for the quick fix or the superficial image, but to pursue things in depth, then that to me would start to make your argument very convincing to me. I'm not saying your argument isn't already a good one. Do you understand what I'm saying though? That if I could
I do
see that, I would say, oh yeah. Then, Robert was really on to something like the ontological depth of this discussion when he was trying to do this.
Well, yes, but I'm not, by the way, I'm not even trying to make a claim necessarily. I'm really trying to just speculate and hypothecate what could happen here. There's something going on, and so we're all trying to figure it out, like what's going on with this thing. But this seems to be, the Platonic work you've introduced me to seems to be most fundamentally addressing that, because it's the question of the relationship between the absolute and the relative.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And that, like you said, that resonates across a lot of domains.
Yes.
But maybe we didn't have the, equipment to talk about this before Bitcoin, because we didn't have absolute money. We had we had a relative absolute. Gold was a relative absolute.
Yeah.
Like no matter, we tried to make a lot of things in the world. Well, gold was the hardest thing to make, basically. So that's why it became money. Now we have something that's absolutely hard to make. We can't make any more of it. They just discovered, by the way, I don't know if you read this, $13 trillion worth of gold in Uganda. They just discovered this like 2 weeks ago. That's the market cap of gold globally is like $12 trillion. So we just doubled the supply of gold with one discovery in Uganda.
Right.
Okay. So, well, that means gold doesn't really work as sound money. I mean, not as well as Bitcoin, at least, because you're not going to discover any more Bitcoin in Uganda.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would just express a lot of gratitude to you for even getting me to this place where it's like, oh, wow, we call this going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, but, and you're always trying to check yourself. Like, am I just making connections where there aren't connections? But it seems like there's something here if it's the actual discovery of absolute scarcity and this relationship that Plato keeps coming back to between the relative and the absolute.
Well, I mean, and I like the fact that you're willing for long periods of time, and I don't mean in any kind of forced fashion. You want to participate in discussing things other than Bitcoin in depth. And for me, that's very important too, because it means you're actually trying to make deep connections as opposed to just trying to drag everything down to Bitcoin, if I can put it that way. Right.
Yeah. I am attempting to be and I didn't know this until reading Plato, but actually be in pursuit of the truth, right? I'm not trying to sell anyone Bitcoin here. I know it may seem that way at times. We talk about it a lot, but it's a fascination. There's a lot of people captivated by this thing. Nobody understands the implications of it, and we're just all trying to figure it out.
Well, I mean, if you'll allow me, you're proposing something and you're making it plausible rather than preposterous. It sounds to me like you're proposing that Bitcoin is the Platonic form of money, which is a really interesting ontological claim to make.
I wanted to ask you if there's anything, I did read this example recently, the work of Lorenz, The Strange Attractor. You've heard of I'm sorry.
You
All right.
know?
So Lorenz is a chaos theory guy or complexity theory guy. He had the water wheel.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do this perfect justice, but basically there's a water wheel with 10 little buckets on it. And then if you increase the flow of water, this water wheel can go into these
Weird
very,
oscillation.
very
Yeah, yeah.
erratic patterns. But then when that, it almost looked chaotic. But then when they plotted the patterns on a three-dimensional
State
graph,
space. Yeah,
yes,
state space diagram.
state
Yeah.
space, it's this beautiful pattern called a strange attractor.
Yeah.
And so
Yes,
people
yes,
had made
yes.
arguments that through chaos theory, we had found the realm of the forms to some extent.
Yes, yes, and I think there's truth to that. I think that we realized the strange attractor is a through line, through what looked like a cacophony, and we realized, no, there's
Yes.
a through line in this, and when we grasp it, we get a depth of understanding of the phenomena that we didn't have before. Yes, very much, very much.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that was the only other example I had ever heard of where we had some direct interface with the realm of the forms, perhaps. But I wanted to
Correct.
ask you if there's anything else that you knew of.
Well, I think there's lots. I mean, we've been exploring a lot of them here. I've been trying to show how the forms are not strange, abstract things in purely conceptual space. They're in the guts of our phenomenology. They're in the guts of reason and love, and how we fundamentally try to make sense and connect the world. That's what I've been trying to do throughout, is to bring it out of I'll put this in quotes, Platonic heaven, and actually show you that it's not that. It is not this up. It's through, and the resonant reciprocal. I've been trying to give many examples throughout our whole discussion of like how we can find the Platonic forms in the very sinews and ligaments of how we, of our intelligence, and how it couples to the intelligibility of the world. That's been my argument throughout, in fact.
And you've done a wonderful job. I should clarify my question a bit. When I saw the mathematical representation of the strange attractor, it was like looking at the realm of the forms,
Yes.
And when I look at the Bitcoin blockchain and its perfect supply curve, like it just does its own thing. Nobody can change it. It just does what it's. I'm like, okay, am I looking at forms here? Like it's something that how do I say? It's something that is just independent of us, I guess, kind of like the sun, right? It has its own sovereignty.
Yes. Well, I mean, if currency is the information flow of a dynamical system, presumably there are attractors within it pointing to constraints, enabling and selective constraints. And that might mean that there is something, in the way we've been talking about it, Platonic, about how we should understand currency. I had never put those two together. The Platonic tradition has a long tradition of, considering currency filthy lucre, right? It's, the people engaged in money are just motivated by sort of their appetites and their passions. And so Plato does not address this. But what you're trying to do is move it off that, and you're trying to understand the fundamental principles at work and what is the form of money. I mean, it's almost like you're changing the question that's the title of your show in a really profound and interesting way.
Well, only here in the courtyard of Dialogos would that question be changed, because I did not reach it on my own. Look, sorry, we probably got 40 minutes left. Do you want to do a 5-minute break and come back? And I didn't mean to hijack the conversation on Bitcoin here. I would love to try to.
Robert, you've been extremely generous in letting me, take Schindler and make all these connections and then try and use it to understand Schindler. I feel it's only fair that I reciprocate, right? And so I found it interesting, and I like, and the fact that you sort of agree that you're sort of proposing that there's a Platonic form of money. I just think that's a fascinating, and then that has implications for treating money justly and being just in relationship to it, and thereby more just with ourselves and with each other. Like in concrete cognitive terms, like reducing the temporal horizon so we're less prone to mythology and intellectual impatience. That's a fascinating and provocative thing to say. It was not a hijacking at all.
Well, I'm really happy, thrilled, honestly, to hear you say that. But I do want to give Schindler his due here, and we are well behind on our outline now, but I guess we can try to wrap up in 40 minutes.
Well, and I mean, it's also good because, I don't want to seem like I'm negligent towards your audience also. And so I want to thank you for allowing me, to discuss with you this, because it does help make connections to your audience,
Yes.
which Socrates always does.
Yeah.
Right? Socrates always adjusts, and I don't mean this in a contemptuous fashion at all. He always adjusts to his interlocutor and where he's a general or he's a military person,
Yes.
or he's this or that. And Socrates always adjusts to that and then works with that. And so, yeah, I'm happy we got to do this.
No, me too. And it's, like a true philosopher, right? He's curating he's becoming as transparent to the truth as he can for his audience, right? And I appreciate that.
Which makes him simultaneously very powerful and powerless. Totally.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah. This thing hit me like a bomb when I read it the first time, that the whole thing is the structure of the dialogue is intended to speak about the nature of dialogue in a way. It's so meta and mind-bending. Is there anything else you want to try to get into the last 35 minutes here?
Well, in connection with that, the inadequacy and indispensability of images, because as you just said, the Republic is an image of dialogue.
Yeah.
And then the idea, the distinction of the imaginary and the imaginal, and how that I think Plato is, or at least Schindler on Plato's behalf is moving in towards the imaginal as opposed to the imaginary. And I think that distinction that comes from Corbin, and he was, by the way, a profound Neoplatonist, and he was, of course, serious interlocutor and discussant with Jung, and you began this whole series with a Jungian quotes. So there's lots of connections there. But I think that distinction can help us get past some of the truncated notions of rationality and some of the reactions to it, like we find in decadent romanticism. Not all romanticism, but the decadent romanticism that's very pervasive in our culture right now.
I'll read an excerpt from page 307 here. Context then is just about everything. It's a very powerful sentence right there.
Yes.
But to affirm this, we must recall is just to say that truth is the whole. To be concerned with the whole is to pay attention to the arrangement of parts. We argued in chapters 2 and 3 that the twofold nature of goodness requires a dramatic presentation, that only a complex plot involving the ascending continuous pursuit and the discontinuous reversal, the surprise that is both unanticipated and fulfilling, can bring light to the whole of the good in a non-reductive manner.
Yeah.
And I was just reminded here again of literature, right? We talked about The Sixth Sense, I think yesterday. It's film, not literature, but somewhat similar. Is it that dialogue or this dramatic structure is mapping onto this feedback-driven complex reality that we inhabit, where, in biology, there's not unidirectional causation. Everything's feedback, right? It's all precession and reversion. That dramatic structure is just what maps onto that.
Yes. And so, and this picks Alicia Uraro in Dynamics in Action to really seriously integrate dynamical systems theory with 4E cognitive science, says that what narrative does, it's not that, right? Narrative gets our cognition, it shapes our cognition into the form that is needed in order to track, right, dynamical systems. And so while it may look like silly superstition that, you know, this group of people are using narrative to try and relate to the forest, myth, right? And we can, of course, right, totally just take apart the myth with our rational tools, rational in that computational sense tools. Because we are stupidly focusing on the propositional to the exclusion of the way this is accessing the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory, and doing a ratio religio so that these people can actually trace the complex dynamics of the ecology of their environment. We are actually the people that are behaving unintelligently and relatively irrational in that context. And so Plato is making that case. So for him, the form and the content have to have that. You can't understand contemplative reason if it is not having a perspectival and participatory transformation on you. It's not shifting you at those levels. And only the dramatic structure in which we both identify and disidentify with characters, we follow the plot only to get it reversed, we get the foreshadowing, but we get the only that can actually properly integrate all the non-propositional with the propositions that are making up the arguments in Plato. And so when, and Schindler is so brilliant at this, right? He just keeps showing you how it's nested, that, you know, Plato keeps, at every level you see, well, scientia intuitiva, you see the whole dialogue in each move, and you see how each move fits into the whole dialogue, and you get this, and you had that, whoa, and then that
it's fractal, right?
Yeah, and you get that, and you're involved in it, and you're participating in it, and it's a reciprocal insight. It's not only an insight into the work, the text, it's an insight into you and how you make sense of things, and then you're getting to participate in the actual activity of the good.
Yes, it is overwhelming. I think I've used that word a million times by now. I want to read just a couple of excerpts here that give an audience a sense for the encoding of this dramatic structure into the Republic. I'm at the bottom of 307. He says, Brunell provides a solid guiding principle for interpretation, proposing that the Republic, like many of the later dialogues, reflects structurally the method the dialogue describes.
Yes.
He notes, as others have, that there is a clear symmetry of structure. All the other themes discussed in the first half of the Republic receive another treatment in a slightly different form in the second half.
Yes.
All, that is, but the good. It is the only major subject treated just once, and his treatment lies in the center of the dialogue as a whole.
Isn't that astonishing? Like, yeah.
And I mean, I don't know, we didn't figure this out until thousands of years later. This interpretation, at least.
No, I mean, I don't want to take anything away from Schindler, and I haven't read this other author that he's citing. I just want to get the name right, Brunell, but the third wave. There's a whole bunch of these people. I mentioned them: Gonzalez, Highland. You know, a bunch of these people doing this. And there's one sense in which, you know, it's the third wave, and it's right bringing all of this in that we're talking about, and it's therefore new and recent, and we should give lots of credit to the brilliance of these people. But if you look in the Neoplatonic tradition, they're doing this with the texts, and they're pushing for the third wave, and pushing for something at least conciliant with the third wave that we're experiencing now. So for me, that's why I keep coming back to, I see a lot of what is being made salient and foregrounded and sized up by this new scholarship, finding some very deep consiliences within the Neoplatonic tradition, which I keep bringing out. And the fact that it wasn't just about discourse, it was primarily bound up with contemplative practices and meditative practices, dialectical practices, ethical practices, of course, etc. And this is what I keep saying, that it's both. That's why I'm trying to get with the inventio, right? It's both something we're discovering and making, but it's also we're recovering something that we have some degree lost when around the end of the Renaissance, and as we went into especially the dominance of nominalism and the Protestant Reformation, they're influencing each other, and the scientific revolution, and they're all influencing each other. And the Neoplatonic interpretation of Plato was basically dismissed and pushed to the margins. And this idea of concentrating on the argumentation of the propositions came to the fore, like it did in everything else. So the answer is yes and no to your question, right? A lot of these people are, and I think Schindler would agree with me on what I'm just saying, by the way, that because I know he thinks that Aquinas was reading Plato and Plotinus this way, and other Thomistic scholars like Sebastian Morello and others are making a very strong case for that. Clark is making a strong case for that. So it's both old and new in that way.
Which is Platonic in and of itself, right? All
Yes,
knowledge
of
is
course.
remembering.
Yeah.
I'll read one more little excerpt here just to give one more sense of this encoding. It's so fascinating. The first half, we could say, presents issues prior to the inbreaking of the good and the introduction of the philosopher. The treatments here will tend to possess a certain provisional character, unfolding the way things are from the perspective of ecclesia and belief.
Right.
The second half, by contrast, will unfold a view of the whole from top to bottom, starting from the absoluteness of philosophy. On the other side, then, there is a gradual ascent to the absolute, and on the other side, a descent from the absolute to the furthest extremities of the relative, from philosophical rule through governmental decay to tyranny, and then finally to the realm of pure appearance.
Right.
Complete understanding, we recall, must also descend from the unhypothetical first principle. The philosopher must return to the cave.
Yes. And so on the first side, you get the ascent, and then the second, yes. And so reading the dialogues is a spiritual exercise for me. And this is something I got from Pierre Hadot, and I would recommend that that's how they should be read. And again, this is a Neoplatonic proposal, that first of all, we are trying to indwell and internalize Socrates, because as we discussed last time, he is the symbol, right, in the Platonic sense of the good. And then as we indwell and internalize the dialogical form and its dramatic structure, we also are, right, we are apprenticing ourselves to the kind of comportment we need in order to cultivate ratio religio in the deepest possible way. And so that's why and Plato for me is a sacred text in that way, because I can return to Plato again and again, and because of this nested fractal structure, I can discover more and more and more. To me, those masterpieces that continually fulfill our promise that if we live them, we will be changed, and then when we come back, we will see in the text that we haven't seen, something we haven't seen before, and then we'll be empowered to live even more deeply. And it's so far, and of course, that's the anagoge, and that's coming out of the cave. So the fact that Plato is writing this way is an attempt to engender in us a momentum into that reciprocal opening, into that anagoge, into that dialectical practice that can lead into a dialogical existence.
I love that you use the verb apprenticing, because that is really, it's perfect. And I'm just blown away that someone could have figured all of this out and put it into a book. It is, I can only imagine who, I guess we don't know much about his influences as far, I know I read it in Pearl. He talked about, is it Plotinus and one other gentleman that influenced Plato?
No, it's the other way around.
Oh, sorry.
Plato's much earlier than Plotinus.
Ah.
And he has, Plato is, of course, deeply influenced by Socrates. He's deeply influenced by
And Socrates
Parmenides.
didn't write, right?
Yeah, no, as far as we know, he
Right,
did not
okay.
write anything. There's lots of people who write about him, Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes. But so the influences are Socrates. He's deeply influenced by Parmenides, who tends to emphasize the absolute, the one, and Heraclitus, who tends to emphasize how everything's in motion and relative and change. Although even Heraclitus talks about the binding through line of the logos. Do not listen to me. Do not listen to my words, but listen to the logos and realize that everything is one. That's Heraclitus. So he's finding, and so Plato is, he's synthesizing, putting together, not just synthesizing. It's almost like the left and right fields of vision integrating into depth perception. He's doing the stereoscopic integration of Heraclitus and Parmenides with Socrates at the center, and then Pythagoras is a huge influence, and essentially, especially about the mathematical musicality of intelligibility.
Yes,
And
yes.
notice we keep using mathematical musical images to try and get at what we're talking about, and those are the primary influences on Plato.
Got it. Yeah. Pythagoras came up for me when I was writing the piece on the zero and Bitcoin, because they were very much fascinated with, they considered form to be musical, I think, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and math to be, because math was geometry, math was spatially extended, especially for
Music.
the Pythagoreans. And so they had a sense of the world was made out of math and music in some really, it's difficult for us. We can't quite get what they were talking about, but you can clearly see the influence on Plato. And Pythagoras is like Socrates. He's this weird, almost shamanic figure. And he stands right on the boundary between philosophy and religion. He's Pythagoras gave us the word philosopher. He gave us the word cosmos. And he really, he emphasized sort of a kind of soul flight, shamanic soul flight, which I think also really powered Plato's interest in self-transcendence. And why Plato often uses flight metaphors when he's trying to talk about the anagogic process.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to page 326 now. And I'll read a quick excerpt. Now, this image does not substitute for discursive reasoning, which we see already in the fact that Socrates explains the significance of various aspects of this image to his interlocutors. Without his explanation, the image would of course lie there dumb. But it is equally the case that a simpler account of its meaning will never do complete justice to everything in it or exhaust its significance.
Yes.
Explanation and image, logos and mythos, I think, maybe that's the wrong word, just like words and deeds, work in tandem to make manifest a whole truth. And it is this whole that the soul essentially desires. I'm not sure if I got logos and mythos correctly because they're written in Greek. I'm pretty sure logos is right, but I'm not sure about the second.
No, you got it right. Logos and mythos. Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah, that this is on the there's a synergy, I guess, between explanation and image, or
they're woven together in dialogue. Look at how much we move between. Again, I would argue because we are trying to constantly align and integrate. Remember we talked about understanding as grasping the significance? Well, there's a kind of understanding in which you're grasping the significance within propositional knowing. and within procedural knowing. You know how this skill fits this situation. But there's also a significance between the kinds of knowing that binds them, and that's a profound kind of understanding. That's the kind of understanding when you attribute to somebody, a wisdom about something. And so the interplay between image, and we have to remember the image includes like the structure of the dialogue. It includes the drama, right? But the interplay between the image, that's why he uses this comprehensive term mythos, and the logos, where again, the logos is not logic. Remember, that's the reduction we're trying. So you've got the logos being everything, and then the mythos, and they're bound together and they interpenetrate. And that's been happening throughout our discussion as we try to understand the dialogue and Socrates. And for me, this I gave a talk. It was an invited lecture at Cambridge. It's on my channel for those of you who are interested, about the interpenetration of rationality and ritual, where ritual is not just a mindless neurotic thing, but it's a dramatic, enacted a form of imagery, right? Enacted mythos that is actually interwoven with what we prototypically think of as rationality. Let me try to give you one example, and it attaches to stuff we've been talking about already. So we've talked about overcoming hyperbolic discounting, the temporal horizon, and how that's connected on one side to mythology, the hatred of the logos, right? And we just did that a few minutes ago. Okay, so keep that, right? But now think about what we also talked about, about part of rationality is how to properly moderate hyperbolic discounting, its adaptivity. Okay, so you go in, this has been done in many different contexts. Hirschfeld talks about this and other people, and this is experimental work I'm going to refer to. You go in and you make a really sound, and I mean this seriously, financial economic argument to academics with evidence that they should start saving for the future now. You give them all kinds of graphs and everything, and they all go, yes, excellent, very well done. Yes, yes. You come back in 6 months and none of them are saving for the future. Okay. Now you do this not in place of, but in addition to the arguments, you get them to imagine their relationship to their future self, because why people aren't saving for the future is they don't want to be religio. They don't want to be bound to that future self, because that future self is old and ugly and prone to sickness. But if you reconfigure it so you get the proper proportioning of attention, so the religio is say, well, don't think of it. Think of that future person as an elderly member of your family that you love and you want to care for. And the more vividly you can do that, the better. And you get two results. When you do that, people start saving, and the more vividly they can imagine, and think about how that's this religio, right? Ratio religio, that future person, the more vividly they can imagine it, the more they will save. So this is the imaginal. So the problem with the word imagination is it covers these two things, and Corbin distinguishes between them. The imaginary is when we use images in our head, and what we're doing is pulling ourselves away from reality. Okay, and there's a role for that, right? Or, creativity. But the imaginal is the use of imagery, not in your head, but enacted in order to enhance your perception of reality. So let me give you first a prototypical instance of the imaginal. The imaginary is when I ask you, imagine a sailboat, and then I can ask you, are its sails up or down? And you can answer me, right? Now, compare that to a child who picks up a stick, right, and ties a blanket around them and says, I am Zorro. They're not forming a mental image. What they're doing is they're trying to take the perspective of Zorro, and they're trying to adopt the agent arena relationship so they can engage in a serious play of realizing certain capacities that they have. Serious play is how all intelligent mammals actually develop. When you use imagination for the sake of perception, when you have imaginally augmented perception, right? This is what the imaginal is. So, for example, when I'm teaching Tai Chi and I want people to stand in the correct stance, first of all, I just do some, bend your knees, tuck in your coccyx. And then I say, okay, I want you to imagine that you're standing in a river and from your knees to your feet, sinking into the mud. You don't want to skim the surface of the floor. You want to sink. And from your knees to your dantian, around your navel, that's like the flowing water of the river. You want that part of you to feel like flowing water. It's got all this flexibility, but it's got force. And then from here up, this is like the air. You want it to feel as airy as possible, right? You want it to almost dissolve away. And when people do that, they start to become, they are enabled to perceive, right? Kinesthetic, propriocetic, small muscle movements in ways that they couldn't if I just told them how to move their body. That's imaginally augmented perception. That's imagination for the sake of perception. Does that make sense? Right? And so that's what's happening with the people, the academics. They are they're using imagination not to drift away from a reality they need to face, but it actually enhances their capacity to conceive, perceive, and even religio, bind themselves to their future self. And see how that is so central to being rational? If you can't overcome, and we've talked about this already, hyperbolic discounting, your rationality is extremely truncated. But all of the propositional argument, all the presenting of the data does not lead these trained academics to save any money, but the imaginal, right, this ritual aspect actually affords it happening. And that's what I think Schindler is trying to point to. The dialogue is imaginal. It's an image that helps us to perceive what Plato is trying to make us aware of.
Wow, that is really powerful. What is the book you mentioned on the imaginal versus imaginary?
There isn't a book.
Oh,
There's an essay and many essays. There are books, but there's an essay by Henry Corbin, Corbin, in which he makes a distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary and the imaginal. If you want a good book on Corbin, I recommend strongly two books by Thomas Cheetham, Cheetham, A World Turned Inside Out, and then you'll like the title of the next book, Imaginal Love. And you'll see that resonates so much with everything we've been talking about. And so I was trying to show, I mean, there's more to ritual than just that, but this idea of imaginally augmented perception that affords the serious play that gets us into the momentum of development.
right.
A ratio religio that is so central to contemplative rationality. And see, they have to contemplate their future self in the right way.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is great example there. I did some therapy at one point a few years ago, and one of the things that came up was I had really stern self-talk.
Yes.
Like, when you make mistakes, you're like, what did you do wrong? And then one of the things he had me do, the therapist, was just talk to myself as if I were talking to my daughter, right? To like a loving child. And just that simple little tweak. So effective in life. Like I had such a better relationship with myself, just as that, which is an imaginal thing, I guess, right? I'm kind of putting myself in a different role.
It's to even put a more of a finer point on it, Robert, it's an imaginal dialogical thing, right? You're doing this imagination, the imaginal, and then you're doing the back and forth discussion. And then it takes on a life of its own and takes you to places you couldn't get at when you're just ruminating and reasoning, right?
Yes, no, you're absolutely right, because you're not only in your self-talk, you're the parent and the child, right?
Yes.
You're
Yes.
like, okay, buddy, we need to go do this, and then I'll reward you with something else. Yeah, very much. You internalize the whole process. It's incredible. That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I will read one more little excerpt here, just on the images thing. On 327, Schindler writes, "The real knower is different from the dreamer, not because he remains outside the cave, but because he believes there is something fair itself and is able to catch sight both of it and of what participates in it, and doesn't believe that what participates is it itself, nor that it itself is what participates. Again, the true is the whole. The most comprehensive philosopher, therefore, has to be like a child begging for both, and say that which is everything is both the unchanging and that which changes, both invisible forms and tangible images."
And the invocation of the child, and Plato invokes, and I think in a couple places Schindler even uses the phrase serious play, the serious play. This point is really important to me about both the inadequacy and the indispensability of the imaginal, the enacted imaginal as the ritual, and how, the love, the right, and reason are bound together. The rational and the ritual, the rational and love, the right, all the things like they're all interpenetrating. I reflect on this because I'm trying to understand how I can cultivate the right virtue and virtuosity to talk to people within, and I hope this doesn't sound condescending because I do not want it to be, and I do not intend it to be. How do I talk to people who are within a religious tradition that I do not belong to? Because I want to, I want to somehow understand both the indispensability of the imagery and the inadequacy in a way that is fair to the images, the way we're trying to be fair to Plato's use of the image. And of course, you can get people, you can get fundamentalists who just claim, an absoluteness. Their images are totally adequate and not just indispensable, they're absolutely necessary. And I find that an untenable claim. And of course, you can also get very sort of liberal approaches which say, oh, whatever you want, it doesn't matter. And that I think is also problematic because that doesn't acknowledge the indispensability of these images, like we've been talking about. And so I'm not going to come to a conclusion here. I'm trying to say that I find Plato, and especially Schindler's discussion of Plato, helpful to see people like Plato and the figures in his dialogue wrestling very deeply with this sort of Janus-faced role of images. They're inadequate, right? But they're indispensable, and they're bound up with love and reason, and how both love and reason are ecstatic. Like the people who they have to love their future self ecstatically so that they can reason beyond their current egocentric perspective and save the money for the future. I wish I could now say, and so here is the Vervaekean profound thing that comes out of that. I don't have anything to say other than I'm finding that going on this journey within the text or in discussion with people like you, I think the exemplification of it is starting to bring some finesse to my ability to interact and discuss in good faith people who belong to, religious communities or elsewise that are otherwise I can't belong. So I guess this was a very convoluted way of saying I really appreciate you bringing this up, and that we talk about it and wrestle with it, and that we aren't coming to any final conclusions, because again I think it's more of how we are the apprentices. We keep wrestling, and now I'm almost doing like a martial art. The more we wrestle with it, the more finesse we get in our ability to wrestle with it.
Yeah, no, that That makes a lot of sense. And, it seems like if people could get to the understanding, I guess it's a Platonic understanding that, as you said, these images, they are indispensable, but they're also provisional,
Yes,
right? They're
yes,
always,
yes.
I don't know, subject to change, I guess, to some extent, but there's
Yeah,
also, I don't know. That's a tricky one. Sorry. Sorry, John. Wish
no,
I
no,
had
no, no.
some
I wasn't.
profound answer.
I wasn't expecting it.
Yeah.
I think I think hopefully we exemplified the answer to that much more than we can put a definition on it.
Yes.
And to the degree to which you've afforded that, I just wanted to end by thanking you. And this has been a wonderful journey together. I hope it has whetted people's appetite for reading the Schindler book and perhaps even thereafter reading The Republic.
Well, I can say for sure you have the best reading recommendations of anyone I've met on this earth. So thank you so far for that. I do just want to go ahead and spoil the very ending of the book by reading the last passage.
Oh, please, please.
Schindler writes, "It is to carry and carry out the delightful burden of philosophy, the task implied in the exhortation that brings the Republic to a close." And there's a Greek word there, a Greek phrase I can't pronounce or read. This verb means not only to be happy, i.e., to possess the good, but also to do it, to live it out in a concrete way and thus make it real. And the first word of the dialogue, if the first word of the dialogue seems to point to Plato, then this final word takes away all seeming. It is the word Plato always used to begin his personal letters, at least those addressed to his friends, those to whom he was bound in goodness.
Yeah, great ending to a great book.
So good. And thank you for being my friend on this journey. And I've learned a lot. I hope everyone found this valuable and learned a lot as well. And I'm excited to go further. I already told you I've devoured the first 2 books you've recommended. I've got a list of probably 10 more. So I look forward to reading those and bombarding you with questions.
Yeah, this was such a wonderful thing. At some point, if you want to go through another text in this way, I'd be happy to journey with you.
Wonderful. John, thank you so much. Really appreciate you doing this.
Thank you so much, Robert. It has been a great pleasure.
Likewise.